Welcome to Truly Scary Ouija Stories. Smash like and subscribe to tread the thin line between reality and the surreal. Let's begin our eerie expedition. In the heart of October, beneath the hollow gaze of a crescent moon, the whispers of the past were about to seep through the cracks of the old Victorian drawing room in Eldridge. The gentle rustle of the autumn leaves outside could hardly mask the thumping of my heart as I, Daniel, skeptic by nature, faced the worn Ouija board that lay ominously on the table before us. It was Sarah's idea. She always had a knack for the peculiar, but tonight, her eyes sparkled with an eerie intensity that I couldn't quite place. Sarah, Mike, and I gathered around, our fingers tentatively touching the planchette. The room was dimly lit by a single lamp, casting long shadows that flickered on the walls, as if dancing to an inaudible tune. The air was thick with the scent of burning cedar from the fireplace, a smoky veil that seemed to blur the line between the living and the spectral. Action beat 1. As Mike cracked a joke about the spirits being on a coffee break, the planchette twitched abruptly under our fingers, silencing us. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a fluke, but the atmosphere had palpably shifted. Sarah's eyes were locked on the board, her expression unreadable. The Ouija board, a relic she claimed to have found in her aunt's attic, suddenly felt like a Pandora's box, its mysteries clawing their way to the surface. With a forced swallow, I reassured myself of the logical explanations that must exist. Yet, as the planchette began to glide across the letters, spelling out hello, an unspoken fear simmered within me. Each letter was a soft echo in the otherwise silent room, a greeting from the unknown. Action beat 2. Who are you? Sarah's voice broke the heavy silence, firm yet noticeably trembling. The planchette accelerated, its movement eager, almost desperate. Jacob. It spelled, and Sarah gasped softly, her hands shaking. I eyed her with concern, realizing there was more to this night than a simple game. Jacob was her older brother, who had drowned tragically during their childhood. The room seemed to grow colder with the revelation, and the playful air with which we had started the night had evaporated entirely. There was a sincerity in Sarah's posture, a silent plea for answers, that locked us all in this unexpected seance. The reality of our game was morphing into something far more serious, far more sinister. As the whispers of Jacob, or whatever claimed his name, filled the spaces of our awareness, a chilling draft swept through the room, as if the veil between worlds had been lifted slightly, allowing the cold fingers of the beyond to touch us. What had begun as a light-hearted exploration was quickly morphing into a journey none of us were prepared for. Action beat 3. Tension knotted my stomach as the planchette's movements became more pronounced, insistently dragging our fingertips across the board. In a low, hesitant murmur, Mike asked, "What do you want from us?" The air felt thick, charged with a palpable dread that seemed to press against our chests. Sarah's grip tightened around the planchette, her knuckles white. "Freme," it answered. The words hung heavily in the room, a morose plea that echoed through the silent house. Each letter seemed to draw something out of Sarah, like the mere act of reading them aloud was sapping her strength. My skepticism waned, replaced by a creeping fear that clawed at my reason. Action beat 4. Sarah's behavior became increasingly erratic. Her eyes were wide, fixated on the board, as if she could see something in the wood grain that we couldn't. Whispering under her breath, she seemed to be communicating directly with this entity. The room's temperature dropped, our breaths visible in the icy air as the fireplace's warmth waned, as if stifled by the chilling presence. Without warning, the planchette spelled out a new message, Betryal. Sarah recoiled as if struck, her face draining of color. Mike and I exchanged worried glances, the game no longer bearing any semblance of innocence. This spectral exchange felt intensely personal, and Sarah's connection to it deeply disturbing. Action beat 5. Compelled by a mix of concern and terror, I insisted we end the session. As I reached to pull her hands from the planchette, it moved with furious speed, spelling out Noescape. My heart raced and cold sweat beaded my forehead. The lights flickered, casting ghostly shadows that danced along the walls, morphing into grotesque shapes. I could hear my own breath, ragged and shallow, as a deep, foreboding sense of dread settled over us. Sarah sobbed quietly, muttering apologies under her breath, her demeanor broken. I realized then that we were not merely participants in this game, but pawns in a horrifying narrative that had been set in motion long before this night. Action beat 6. In a desperate bid to regain control, Mike lunged forward and threw the Ouija board into the fireplace. The flames hissed and roared as if angered by the intrusion, casting an eerie glow that momentarily illuminated the room with a demonic red light. The planchette skittered across the floor, spinning wildly before coming to a sudden, unnerving halt. The air was thick with the smell of burnt wood and something foul that wasn't there before. As the board blackened and curled at the edges, a howl, distant yet distinct, echoed down the chimney, bouncing off the walls of the drawing room, a sound both of freedom and of fury. For a moment, there was silence, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly, allowing us to breathe a little easier. Action beat 7. However, the respite was short-lived. The house began to settle uneasily, groans and creaks emanating from its very structure as if it were complaining about an old, deep pain. Shadows flickered at the edge of my vision, whispering promises and threats in equal measure. We watched in horror as dark, smoky tendrils seeped from the charred remnants of the Ouija board, reaching out like the fingers of a scorned lover. The lights flickered violently before extinguishing completely, plunging us into terrifying darkness. A cold dread settled in my heart as Sarah, her voice trembling with fear and guilt, confessed that she had made a pact with this spirit to save her brother's life years ago, a pact she had failed to fulfill. Ending. By the dim light of dawn filtering through the curtains, we sat, surrounded by the remnants of the night's terror. Exhausted and pale, we were different people from the ones who had laughingly placed our fingers on the planchette. The promise of daylight offered little comfort, as the shadows of the night lingered in our minds, a haunting melody that wouldn't cease. The Ouija board was destroyed, but the entity had marked us, a claim it refused to relinquish. As we left the house, each of us carried the weight of the night's revelations, and a chilling certainty that the doors we had opened would never truly close. Haunted by nightmares and unexplained occurrences, we were left to ponder the reality of our experience. Each whisper of the wind a reminder of the pact Sarah had unwittingly drawn us into. Forever altered, we faced a world that now seemed as mysterious and unpredictable as the flickering planchette on a Ouija board. In the dim light of flickering candles, each shadow dancing on the walls felt like a silent whisper from beyond. It was Halloween night, an evening shrouded in superstition and the playful celebration of fear. Yet, as the winds howled like restless spirits against the windows of my old family home, I found myself unexpectedly chilled by the anticipation of what was mere moments from unfolding. Growing up, my grandmother used to say, "Nathan, there's much about this world that lies beyond the veil of the living. Always respect what you can't understand." Her words, usually dismissed by my logical mind, felt suddenly pertinent as I stared at the dusty Ouija board before us. Somehow, the quaint gathering with my friends had taken a curious turn when Mia, always enchanted by the arcane, had unearthed the board from the attic. Just for fun, she had claimed. Yet, as everyone took their places around the ancient board, I couldn't shake off a foreboding sense of dread. As if compelled by an unseen force, we all delicately placed our fingers on the old wooden planchette. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows that seemed to play tricks on our eyes. "Is there anyone here with us?" Mia asked with a mixture of curiosity and excitement, her voice a stark contrast to the heavy silence that enveloped the room. For a long moment, nothing happened, and I almost allowed myself to relax, attributing my grandmother's warnings to old age fantasies. But then, without warning, the planchette jerked abruptly under our fingers, gliding with an assertive force that caused a collective gasp around the circle. It moved to the top right of the board, hovering decisively over yes. The room grew colder. The playful air that had accompanied our initial curiosity evaporated, replaced by a tense uncertainty.
Action beat 2.
Usually the skeptic swallowed hard, his eyes widening as he stared at the board. "This isn't funny. Who's pushing it?" he demanded, his voice a harsh whisper that barely masked his fear. "It's not us, Derek. It's moving on its own," Mia replied, her voice both terrified and thrilled. I remained silent, a sinking feeling in my stomach as memories of my grandmother's warnings echoed in my mind. The planchette, as if possessed by a will of its own, began to glide again, this time spelling out a name none of us recognized, Eliza. It stopped abruptly, and the candles flickered as if struggling against an invisible breeze. The name hung in the air like a verdict, causing a shared shiver to travel through the group. My hands trembled on the planchette, and for the first time in my life, my skepticism faltered, crumbling under the weight of the undeniable reality before us. Action Beat 3. The tension in the room peaked as the revelation of the name Eliza seemed to stir an unseen presence among us. Feeling emboldened, or perhaps compelled by fear, Mia leaned closer to the board. "Eliza, are you the one moving the planchette?" she asked, her voice a mixture of fear and fascination. The planchette buzzed under our fingertips as if charged with electricity and moved sharply to yes. The confirmation sent a chill down my spine, and the room temperature seemed to drop further, causing our breaths to fog in the candlelit room. Silence enveloped us, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to press against our ears. Action Beat 4. Derek, trying to assert some logic into the situation, cleared his throat, his usual bravado faltering. "What do you want from us, Eliza?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. The planchette started to move once more, this time with slow, agonizing precision. "FREED, it spelled out. My heart raced. The implications of the word spun through my mind, raising unanswerable questions about its true intent. Did freedom for her mean entrapment for one of us? We exchanged nervous glances, but before anyone could react further, the sound of a low, mournful moan echoed through the house, seeming to emanate from the very walls around us. It was a sound that resonated with despair and longing, tethering Eliza's presence to an emotion that was palpably human yet frightfully spectral. Action Beat 5. Rattled yet bound by a morbid curiosity, Mia pressed on. "How can we help you gain your freedom, Eliza?" she whispered, the weight of her words heavy in the cold air. The planchette moved again, this time more frantically, as though Eliza was desperate to communicate. It spelled out LIGATTHECANDLE. Confused, we scanned the room, noticing for the first time an old, unlit candle positioned in the far corner of the room, set within a circle of strange, unintelligible symbols. My rational mind screamed danger, urging me to end this madness, yet the part of me awakened by fear was too afraid to disobey. With shaky hands, I lit the candle, and as its flame flickered to life, the room was filled with an oppressive heat, and the walls seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Eliza's sorrow, it appeared, had been momentarily appeased, but at what cost? Action Beat 6. As the flame stabilized, an eerie silence fell over us. The disturbing pulsing of the walls ceased, but the temperature in the room did not return to normal. Instead, a new coldness swept through, chilling us to the bone. The planchette shot across the board, forcefully spelling out THANQYOU. At that moment, a series of fast, soft knocks echoed around the room, coming from the walls, the floor, even the ceiling, as though something or someone was trying to break through from another dimension. Mia, her face pale, whispered a question into the weighted silence. "Are you free now, Eliza?" The planchette moved sluggishly this time, with a heartbreaking slowness that seemed to drain the energy in the room, directing itself to no. Instead, it spelled out a new, more ominous message, TOOLATE. It was a stark, terrifying statement that reverberated through my very soul. What had we done? What had we freed? Before we could process the full implication of the message, the air around us began to distort, as if the fabric of reality itself was being twisted and pulled. A low, guttural groan emanated from the center of the room, and a shadowy form began to materialize. It was a silhouette, indistinct yet unmistakably human, a manifestation of despair and agony that radiated from the murky figure. Panic seized us, and in a collective, unspoken agreement, we recoiled from the board, breaking contact. Ending, the apparition faded as suddenly as it had appeared, leaving a heavy darkness that was palpable. The candles blew out spontaneously, plunging us into near total darkness, save for the moonlight straining through the storm-battered windows. We sat in silence, each of us grappling with the harrowing experience, the boundaries of our reality irrevocably altered. From that night forward, my life was no longer the same. No longer could I cling to my skepticism, for the haunting of Eliza had embedded a relentless terror deep within me. My home, now a nexus of unexplained phenomena, served as a constant reminder of that Halloween night. Whispers in the darkness, unexpected cold breezes, and fleeting shadows were my new norm, each a stark testament to the truth of the supernatural. I had sought to understand, perhaps even control, the unknown, driven by human arrogance and curiosity. Instead, I had unlocked a door that was meant to stay closed, a door that perhaps all the rational minds in the world should fear and respect. Echoes of my grandmother's warnings circled in my memories, now a haunting lullaby that reminded me of the price of disrespecting the unseen. The air was crisp, the kind of piercing cold that sinks right to the bones, forewarning the recklessness of dabbling with the unseen on a night such as Halloween. A rattle of dead leaves followed my hurried steps towards the aged Victorian home that stood stoically at the end of Elm Street. It was the kind of house that whispered secrets through its creaking woodwork and fogged glass windows, a perfect setting for our night of ghostly thrill. I had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to partake in the evening's main entertainment, a session with a Ouija board. Little did I know, this night would irreversibly alter my grasp on reality. Entering the dimly lit foyer, I was greeted by the pungent scent of burning sage, mingled with the laughter and excited chatter of my friends. The room was set with eerie ambiance, candles flickering at every possible nook, and antique portraits staring down as if they too were keen on witnessing the night's unearthly proceedings. Chloe, the ardent believer of our group, had her hands wrapped around the old wooden planchette as if it were a sacred relic. Alongside her, the rest of our gang, including jovial Mark, whose laughter often filled the air with an infectious warmth. I, Ethan, remained a skeptic, unfazed, yet intrinsically curious about the night's potential revelations. As the clock tolled ominously, marking the descent into the witching hour, we gathered around the cold mahogany surface of the Ouija board, stationed in the center of the lounge. "Let's keep it lighthearted, yes?" I suggested, casting a wary glance at Chloe, whose eyes glittered with an unsettling mixture of excitement and fear. Ignoring my plea, she ceremoniously positioned the planchette at the starting point, and we all tentatively placed our fingers on its smooth, heart-shaped body. Action beat 1. Chloe's voice fluttered through the dim room, soft yet commanding. "Spirits of the past, we summon thee to join us tonight. Speak to us through this vessel. Make your presence known." Her words felt like an invisible layer of ice forming in the room, chilling and immediate. The candlelight wavered, flicking shadows across our tense faces as we waited. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the planchette began to inch across the board toward yes. A collective gasp swept through the group as the reality of the situation began to dawn. Something beyond our understanding was responding. Mark's usually playful demeanor darkened, his eyes widening with both awe and fear, a mirroring of the emotions flickering through every soul present. Action beat 2. The atmosphere grew oppressively heavy, as though the air itself was thickening. "Who are you?" Chloe whispered into the hushed void. The planchette moved with more intent this time, spelling out THEFRGOTTEN. A chill whispered down my spine, the humor of our earlier adventures dissipating into a grave seriousness. "The forgotten? Who or what is that?" I muttered, unable to mask my skepticism mingled with burgeoning dread. Yet, before anyone could theorize, the ominous force continued, spelling SECRETSWILUNFOLD. The candles flickered as if struggling against an unseen storm, casting our shadows in a macabre dance against the walls. The light touch of the planchette under our fingers felt increasingly like the pull of a powerful tide, inevitable and unstoppable. We were no longer players in this game, we were pawns. Action beat 3. The tension in the room escalated as an eerie silence followed the spirit's cryptic message. Mark, trying to inject some levity back into the situation, half-jokingly asked, "All right, what kind of secrets are we talking about here? Who's been stealing cookies from the cookie jar?" A nervous chuckle rippled through the group. but it died quickly as the planchette swiftly moved to spell out Betrayal. The word hung in the air like a heavy fog, pressing down on us with its implication. Suddenly, the jovial mask fell from Mark's face, replaced by a pale, stricken look. He withdrew his fingers from the planchette, hastily, as if burned. The light-hearted evening we had envisioned was slipping through our fingers, morphing into a nightmarish reality that none of us had prepared for. Action beat 4. Despite Mark's visible discomfort, Chloe pressed on, driven by a mix of fear and fascination. "Who has been betrayed?" she asked in a quivering tone. The response came quickly, more forceful this time, as the planchette urgently scraped across the board to ALL. This revelation sent a wave of paranoia crashing through us. Glances were exchanged, each of us silently questioning the depths of the friendships we had nurtured over the years. The room grew colder, the shadows darker, and the flickering candlelight painted our faces with grotesque masks. It felt as if the walls themselves were closing in, suffocated by the heavy secret revealed by the spirit. Trust, the very thread that tied our group together, had been called into question, and skepticism turned to fear as I realized that we were delving into depths none of us were prepared for. Action beat 5. Caught in a maelstrom of doubt and fear, our group seemed to fracture, the edges of our camaraderie fraying as the spirit continued its torment. "Why are you telling us this?" Chloe demanded, her voice a mix of anger and desperation. The planchette moved again, this time spelling out FREEDOM. A cold understanding began to dawn on me. This spirit sought release, and it saw us, or one among us, as its ticket out. As this terrifying thought processed, the candles snuffed out in unison, plunging us into darkness. Our screams matched the sudden crescendo of a wind that had begun to howl through the house, as though the building itself was protesting the presence of the entity we had invited into our midst. When the lights flickered back on, the planchette had moved off the board, and an oppressive feeling of being watched settled heavily in the room. Action beat 6. In the sudden aftermath, our group huddled closely, a collective instinct to seek comfort in numbers. The playful spirit of the evening was irrevocably shattered, replaced by a visceral fear of the unknown. Chloe, trembling but resolute, reached out to place the planchette back on the board. "What do you want from us?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The planchette stirred once more, this time with an urgency that seemed to pulse through the air. "RELEASEME," it spelled out rapidly. The walls creaked ominously as it moved, and a cold gust swept through the room, as if the spirit's plea was echoed by the house itself. "How?" Chloe responded, her curiosity wrestling with her terror. "A PACT," the board replied. Mark's earlier discomfort returned tenfold, the shadows under his eyes darkening as he processed the implications. He confessed, in a broken voice, that he had used the board before alone, unknowingly whispering promises into the void. His initial denial of any serious happenings crumbled as we realized our night was not the beginning, but a culmination. Action beat 7. The atmosphere intensified with a palpable dread seeping into every corner of the room. Urged by the growing terror and desperation to end this nightmare, Chloe pressed, "What pact did you make?" As she finished her query, the planchette violently flew from the board, crashing against the opposite wall. We stood aghast as a voice, chillingly clear, filled the room without a discernible source. "A trade of souls for mortal desires." The words echoed, bouncing off the walls with a sinister resonance. The truth surfaced. The spirit had manipulated events from beyond, ensnaring Mark into inviting new players into its game, fulfilling the pact he had unknowingly made. Our horror was complete, understanding that each of us was now bound to a fate far beyond our worst nightmares. Ending. The realization that our souls were the currency in a deal struck by naivety and sealed by the supernatural left us fragmented, unable to trust as we once did. As days turned into weeks, strange occurrences plagued us, shadows moving in the corner of our eyes, distant whispers calling our names, and dreams haunted by the figure of the forgotten. Each of us carried the burden of that night, an indelible mark on our lives. Our gatherings grew sparse, the fear and suspicion too palpable to ignore. Friendships that had once provided comfort and laughter now felt like chains binding us to a dark past we could never escape. the weight of the knowledge that somewhere in the spectral plane, a spirit held sway over our very beings was a constant shadow over our existence. That night, carelessness and curiosity dragged us into a realm we were ill-prepared to navigate. The spirit, once confined to the whispers of the Ouija board, now lingered in every solitary moment, a reminder that some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Imagine being haunted not just by a ghost, but by a past you didn't know could break the boundaries of time and reality. What if the board game you played in jest remembers every word you said, every laugh shared, and every fear whispered? This isn't just a story. It's a haunting that begins with a seemingly innocent game, where words spoken can never be taken back. The old wooden door of our usual rendezvous, the slightly decaying college home that Jenna had recently bought, creaked eerily as I pushed it open. Light spilled out from the inside, casting long shadows that danced across the overgrown garden path. Laughter and music streamed out, wrapping around me like a warm blanket. It was a reunion, a reconnection with old college friends whose lives had diverged into adulthood, with only social media scraps keeping us loosely stitched together. Stepping inside, I was immediately enveloped in hugs and hearty pats on the back. Jenna, ever the mystical enthusiast, wore a flowing skirt that seemed to flutter with a life of its own. Marco, looking like he had just stepped out of a courtroom, still managed a grin that was every bit as genuine as it was during our late-night cram sessions. As the night deepened, red wine flowed and loosened tongues wove tales of the past, tales that perhaps grew taller with each telling. The room was warm, comfortably cluttered with mismatched furniture and draped with multicolored scarves that Jenna swore protected us from bad vibes. It was amidst this atmosphere of jovial nostalgia that someone, I still swear it was Marco in his infinite wisdom, unearthed an old Ouija board from a dusty cupboard. "It's just for laughs," Marco said with a dismissive wave of his hand as he placed the weathered board in the center of the creaky coffee table. I remember chuckling, a sound tinged with disbelief. "Do you really think we'll summon a ghost tonight? Or is this another one of your lawyer tricks to make us confess our darkest secrets?" I asked, the skeptic in me rising to the surface like a reflex. But Jenna was already setting the mood, dimming the lights and lighting candles that flickered shadows across our faces, turning our expressions into something flickering and surreal. She settled herself on the floor by the board, her fingers lightly touching the planchette. "Let's just have fun with it. Maybe we'll contact Shakespeare and finally settle whether he wrote all his plays." The initial laughter and jokes began to wane as the planchette started to creep across the board under the hesitant touch of our fingers. Silent anticipation replaced scoffs. Action beat 1. Our first question: was Innocent here with us? The planchette moved with a slow, almost imperceptible pull towards yes. A collective breath caught in our throats. The candle flames trembled, casting eerie shadows that seemed to play tricks on our eyes. Was it just the flicker of the candle causing it to seem as if the shadows were leaning closer, listening in? Jenna's voice was barely above a whisper, an unusual edge of seriousness dulling her usual playful tone. "Who is here with us?" The planchette moved again, this time with more purpose, more assurance. It spelled out Maria. A chill seemed to sweep through the room, the kind that digs into your bones. This wasn't a name familiar to any of us, yet it hung in the air like a specter we all somehow recognized. "Who is Maria?" Marco asked, his voice steady but his skepticism replaced with a trace of something else. Curiosity, perhaps, or was it fear? The atmosphere in the room had shifted palpably. No longer was there any laughter or scoffing at the silliness of the game. Everyone's gaze was fixed intently on the Ouija board, as if it were a lifeline that might explain the sudden drop in temperature and the odd feeling of being watched. The candles flickered aggressively, as if caught in a non-existent wind, and Marco cleared his throat before posing another question, with a caution he typically reserved for negotiating. "Tough legal deals. What do you want from us, Maria?" The planchette slid swiftly across the board this time, its movement almost frantic. "WATCH," it spelled out before coming to an abrupt halt. The room fell silent, each of us exchanging uneasy glances. The word watch echoed ominously in the now chillingly cold room. It felt as though every shadow, every flicker of candlelight was alive, watching and waiting. With rising apprehension, Jenna hesitated before speaking again, her voice a mixture of fear and fascination. "Why do you want us to watch?" Before our eyes, and without any of our fingers touching it, the planchette started to move independently, scraping lightly against the wood of the board as it spelled out, TONIGHT. A sense of dread settled over us, heavier than the shadows that seemed to creep closer from the corners of the room. This was no longer just an old college game revived for nostalgia's sake. Something inexplicable was unfolding. Action beat 5. I could feel the skeptic in me being smothered by the thickening atmosphere of fear. In an attempt to regain some control, I proposed a test, one that I hoped would prove this was nothing more than our collective imaginations running wild. "If you are really with us," I directed my voice toward the empty air that now seemed filled with the weight of invisible presences. "Give us a sign." No sooner had the words left my lips than a harsh scraping sound echoed from the kitchen, like chairs being dragged across the floor. Several of us jumped, turning toward the sound, hearts racing. There was a palpable sense of something approaching, something that was no longer confined to the board but had taken an interest in us, lingering just beyond the reach of the flickering candlelight. In the eerie silence that followed, only the sound of our uneven breaths filled the room, each of us frozen, waiting, watching, as Maria had commanded. The chilling encounters escalated as shadows seemed to stretch and twist around the dimly lit room, morphing into sinister forms. I suggested, half in denial and half in dread, that we close the session. A proposal met with eager nods. Jenna's hands trembled as she moved the planchette to goodbye. But the moment the word was completed, the candles snuffed out in unison, plunging us into darkness. A collective gasp filled the air, pierced by a sudden, oppressive silence. In that darkness, the oppressive sense of something unseen but intensely present enveloped us. It was an encroaching void, thick with the palpable heartbeat of something ancient and malevolent. Fear clutched at my throat as soft, whispering voices filled the room, the words unintelligible, filled with a sinister hiss that made my skin crawl. Action beat 7. Flashlights flickered on, beams cutting through the darkness with trembling uncertainty. As light returned, it became apparent that something had changed. The air felt denser, charged with static. Marco, usually the composed one, whispered hoarsely, "We need to leave now." As we gathered our belongings, preparing to flee the nightmare that had invaded the safety of our reunion, a loud, heart-stopping bang echoed from the hallway. The front door slammed shut by an unseen force, its reverberation a clear denial of escape. Jenna sobbed quietly, her earlier enthusiasm for the supernatural transformed into regret. Marco tried the door, his efforts futile as it remained unyielding, sealed as if by the very spirits we had dared to contact. Panic crept up my spine as the realization dawned on us. Maria, or whatever had come through, wasn't going to let us go easily. Ending. Bound by the haunting and unable to leave, we were left with no choice but to confront what we had awoken. One by one, my friends broke, their mental fortitude crumbling under the weight of our grim predicament. Jenna, whispering apologies to the air, sat frozen by the silent board. Marco paced relentlessly, a man on the edge of reason. As for me, I awaited dawn, watching as the first light filtered through the curtains, its warmth a stark contrast to the cold dread that had settled in my bones. The daylight emboldened us enough to try the door again, which mysteriously opened as if no force had ever held it shut. We left the house not as friends who had shared a playful night of reunion, but as survivors marked by an unseen scar. Something had changed within me, a shiver that ran down my spine every time the wind whispered, a jump at every shadow in my peripheral vision. Maria and the pact forgotten in youthful folly remained etched in my reality, an echo of the dam that refused to fade even as time moved on. The Ouija board, untouched and dusty, stayed behind in the house, a relic of a night when boundaries were crossed and past follies were paid in full. It was a reminder that some doors, once opened, might let in more than just spirits. They might let in the darkness itself, lurking just beyond the veil, forever watching, forever waiting. The storm had already begun to gnash its teeth against the windows of the old porterhouse, as Sarah, Mike, and I huddled around the worn Ouija board that lay atop the dusty living room table. The air tasted of old wood and the slight tinge of mildew that crept along the walls. It was supposed to be a night for seeking closure, for touching something beyond, the unseen, as Mike liked to call it. Yet all I felt was dread pooling in my gut. I never thought I'd find myself back at the porterhouse, with its peeling wallpaper and memories layered like sediment in a forgotten sea. But here we were, looking for answers only the dead might possess, under the restless flash of lightning that seized the sky outside. "Are you sure about this, Jacob?" Sarah's voice cut through the muffled drumming of rain against the roof, her eyes green pools of concern. Her fingers hesitated over the planchette, the heart-shaped piece of wood poised to move at the slightest touch. Mike, ever the enthusiast, countered her worry with a grin, his eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and excitement. "It's just a game," he said, though the ominous flicker of candles belied his casual tone. "Besides, we might actually contact someone, maybe even your brother, Jacob." I swallowed, my mouth dry. The mention of my brother churned something bitter in my stomach. Luke's passing, unexpected and unyielding, had left a void no seance could fill. Yet there I was, driven by a swelling mix of desperation and skepticism, hoping against reason that we might breach the veil that separated the living from the dead. Sarah shot Mike a warning glance before returning her attention to me. "If it gets too intense, just say the word and we stop. No questions asked." Nodding, I took a deep breath, staring down at the letters inscribed in the wood, aged and almost mystical. "All right, let's do this," I finally muttered, placing my fingers lightly beside Sarah's. Mike initiated, his voice barely above a whisper, yet firm against the howl of the wind. "Is there anyone here with us? Anyone who wishes to communicate?" The planchette stirred, a slow, almost indiscernible movement at first, as if awakening from a long slumber. The candles flickered as though agitated by the presence we summoned, casting quivering shadows against the walls. Heart-pounding, I watched, caught between the world I knew and another I had only glimpsed in nightmares. As the planchette moved with sudden intent, speeding across the board to rest decisively over "yes," the room seemed to drop several degrees in temperature, enveloping us in a sudden cold that was as much felt on the skin as it was within the bones. Mike's smile faltered slightly, his earlier bravado ebbing away. Sarah's grip on my hand tightened, and I realized then that there was no turning back. We had opened a door, one that might not so easily be closed. A door into the darker recesses of the unknown, where the answers we sought waited, eager and perhaps not as benign as we hoped. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to crowd closer as the candles sputtered, struggling against an unseen chill that swept through the dilapidated living room. Mike, regaining some of his earlier composure, pressed on, his voice a mix of fascination and underlying fear. "Who are you? Can you tell us your name?" The planchette began to glide again, with more urgency this time, as if the spirit had been eagerly anticipating the question. It moved quickly, spelling out a name. Andrew. "Andrew," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "Are you at peace, Andrew?" The air felt thick, charged with a tension that made it hard to breathe. My heart raced as the planchette abruptly slid to no. The simple answer echoed like a cry in the darkness, a stark reminder of the reality we had trespassed into, a realm of unresting spirits and unresolved stories. I felt Sarah squeeze my hand harder, her nails digging slightly into my palm. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering candlelight and the deepening fear that what we were doing was far from a mere game. "What do you want from us, Andrew?" Mike asked, his voice a notch lower, the edges of his bravado peeling away under the weight of the atmosphere that pressed in around us. The planchette moved again, this time with a purpose that felt almost violent in its speed. It spelled out, "Help me." Over and over, the board repeated the plea, "Help me, help me, help me," until Mike forcibly withdrew his hands, his face pale and drawn. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice cracking as he stood up, knocking his chair backward. "This isn't right. We have to stop this, now." Sarah and I were left staring at the board, both of us too shaken to move. The candles flickered one last time before going out completely, plunging us into darkness. interrupted only by the sporadic lightning that revealed the fear etched deeply on each other's faces. "We need to end this properly," Sarah said, her voice barely audible over the storm. "We can't just leave it like this." Trembling, she reached out, fumbling for a candle to relight it and restore some semblance of control. As the feeble light pushed back against the enveloping darkness, I forced my hands to move, my fingers cold and stiff as I touched the planchette once more. "Andrew, we are going to say goodbye now," I declared, my voice steady despite the fear that clawed at my throat. "You must go back to where you came from. You cannot stay here." The planchette moved sluggishly, as if reluctantly, before finally hovering over goodbye. The sense of oppressive cold lifted slightly, a palpable easing of the room's atmosphere, as if a heavy weight had been momentarily lifted. But the relief was short-lived, replaced by a whispering sound that seemed to seep from the very walls, chilling us to our cores. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of disjointed voices that swirled around the darkened room. Our hearts pounded in unison with each surge of the storm outside, as if the house itself pulsed with a life force once awakened. Sarah, Mike, and I huddled together, our eyes wide as we struggled to locate the source of the eerie murmurs. "It's not over," Mike muttered, his voice thin with horror. "That wasn't Andrew. I think we contacted something else." Sarah shivered beside me, her breaths quick and panicked. "What do we do now? We said goodbye." I peered into the darkness, trying to discern shapes in the fleeting lightning. "We need to find out what it wants," I said, a resolve to end this nightmare hardening within me, despite the dread that gnawed at my mind. With tentative hands, we placed our fingers back on the planchette. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice stronger than I felt. "What do you want from us?" The planchette stirred once more, eerily precise as it spelled out "beware." Immediately after, it darted to spell "find me." Confusion and fear mingled as we tried to interpret the message. "Find you? Find you where?" Sarah's voice cracked under the strain. Lightning illuminated the room in a stark white flash, revealing a small, concealed compartment underneath the table holding the Ouija board. Trembling, I reached out and opened it, discovering an old, tattered envelope. Inside, a note was scrawled in shaky handwriting. "Beware the spirit of the board. It lies, deceives, and binds. You must not let it loose." Our breaths caught in our throats as the reality of our situation settled over us like a shroud. We hadn't been speaking to the benign spirit of a person named Andrew, but something far older and more sinister, an entity bound to the board. "We have to contain it back within the board," I said, grabbing the note. This was a warning. Gathering our collective resolve, we joined hands, our touch conveying the fear and determination that pulsed through us. "You are bound to this board," I declared, feeling the intensity of our wills forging a barrier. "We did not summon you by choice, and you are not welcome here." The planchette moved frantically, as if in protest, darting across the board, spelling nonsensical words and phrases, a manifestation of its fury and desperation. But we held firm, repeating our chant, feeling the atmosphere in the room slowly change, the cold receding slightly, the whispers dropping to a hiss. Finally, with a violent jerk that nearly broke our circle, the planchette swooped to goodbye. The whispering ceased abruptly, leaving only the sound of heavy rain and our ragged breaths. Exhausted and shaken, we sat back, the board quiet between us. "Is it over?" Mike asked, voice barely a whisper. "It's never really over," I replied. My eyes locked on the board that seemed far less innocuous now. These things, once invited, leave echoes. Echoes that sometimes linger. We left the Porter house as soon as the dawn broke, the storm having passed, leaving the world washed clean and eerily silent. But the weight of what we experienced hung over us, a silent echo of the unseen that I knew, deep down, would never completely leave us. As I looked back at the house, it seemed to watch us leave, a sentinel to secrets and stories better left undisturbed. The rain was relentless that night, pattering against the stained windows of the old Victorian house like a million desperate fingers tapping for entry. Even as I approached the grand, somber-looking archway of Mia's family home, shadows seemed to lurk in the corners of my vision, flitting away whenever I tried to focus. I shivered, not just from the chill of the autumn storm, but from an inexplicable dread that clawed at my insides. Inside, The warmth of the fireplace and the familiar faces of my friends, Jamie, Chris, and Mia, did little to temper the eerie atmosphere that clung to the cobwebbed ceilings and the ancient wallpaper, peeling like dead skin. As Mia greeted me with her usual bright smile and an enthusiastic hug, the house felt alive, as if it were breathing with us, settling deeper into its foundations. Perfect night for our little reunion, right? Jamie's attempt to light the mood was palpable as he handed me a steaming cup of cider. His attempt only half succeeded. It was then that Chris, with his characteristic grin that spelled both trouble and excitement, pulled the cloth off an object on the living room table. An old Ouija board lay beneath, its letters faded but still foreboding, the planchette a silent sentinel in the center. "I found this in the attic," Chris announced, his eyes gleaming with a mix of thrill and mischief. "What do you say we add a little adventure to our night?" Mia hesitated, casting a nervous glance around her ancestral home. "I don't know, Chris. This house, it has history." But curiosity, as it often does, overcame our initial reservations. The storm outside had knocked out the power, and with nothing but candlelight casting dancing shadows on the walls, we gathered around the Ouija board. The flickering light seemed to animate the board, giving life to the words etched in wood. "Yes, no, hello, goodbye." "Is there anybody here with us?" Chris asked, his voice a mix of skepticism and hope. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, our breaths held in a collective silence. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the planchette crept towards yes. My heart raced, and not entirely from fear. There was an exhilaration in the unknown, a dark curiosity that welled up from somewhere deep within me. The candles flickered as if in a sudden draft, casting elongated shadows across the wall that swayed like specters. Jamie swallowed hard, his earlier jovial demeanor replaced with furrowed brows. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The planchette moved again, more confidently this time, the wood creaking softly under our fingers. It spelled out slowly, Evelyn. Mia gasped, her face draining of color. "That's my mother's name," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mix of fear and sorrow. She had never mentioned her mother much, only that she had passed away in this very house many years ago. The revelation hung in the air, heavy like the storm clouds outside. Here we were, in Mia's haunted house, contacting a spirit that claimed a name we could not ignore. What had begun as a playful delve into the paranormal was suddenly starkly personal and intensely more real. As the wind wailed outside, mirroring our mounting unease, we knew that whatever game we thought we were playing had changed. We were no longer the players, we were part of the game itself. The air seemed to thicken, oppressive in its stillness, as Mia asked with a trembling voice, "Mom, is that really you?" The candles around us flickered wildly as if caught in a storm, despite the still air inside the room. The planchette moved with urgency now, sliding under our fingertips with a purpose that had all of us stifling screams. It spelled out one word, warning. "What are you warning us about?" I dared to speak, my scientific curiosity piquing despite the terror that set my heart pounding against my chest. Chris's hand trembled on the planchette, his usual bravado waning in the shadow of the unfolding reality. The response was swift and chilling. The pact. Jamie pulled his hand back as if scorched, shaking his head. "No, this isn't right. We shouldn't be messing with this. We need to stop." His voice was a panicked whisper, but his protest was drowned out by a sudden gust that slammed the house, causing the windows to rattle and the doors to groan. Mia, holding back tears, pressed on, her need for answers overpowering her fear. "What pact, Mom? Please tell us what you mean." As the planchette spelled out renew, the room seemed to darken, the candlelight dimming as if being choked. The shadows at the corners of the room grew taller, their edges sharper, almost menacing. I could feel something shift in the atmosphere, a coldness that seeped into my bones. It was as if the darkness itself thickened, filling the room with a dread that was almost palpable. Whispered voices filled the air, too low to make out, but filled with urgency that made my skin crawl. "Enough of this," Chris finally declared, standing up suddenly, causing the planchette to fly off the board and clatter onto the floor. The candles went out as if snuffed by an invisible breath, plunging the room into darkness. Mia screamed, a sound that cut straight through the marrow. I scrambled for matches, my hands shaking violently. When the candles were lit once more, Chris was nowhere to be seen. The front door was wide open, the storm raging visibly through the threshold, as if it had come alive, angry and howling. "Mia, when were you going to tell us your house needed a spectral pact renewed?" Jamie's voice was accusatory, his fear turning into frustration. "I didn't know," Mia shot back, tears streaming down her face. "All I knew were the old family tales, silly ghost stories. I didn't think any of it was real." The cold seeped deeper, an unnerving silence falling over us as we stood, staring at the gaping door, none daring to step outside into the storm. The house felt no longer just a house, but a living, breathing entity, aware of our trepidation and perhaps even feeding off it. As we gazed into the inky darkness of the night, the reality of our situation settled in. We were part of something much larger and far more sinister than a mere game. A dread-filled silence enveloped the room, broken only by the echoes of the storm beyond the open doorway. "We need to find Chris," I said, my voice shaking with a mix of determination and fear. The need to do something, anything, to break the paralysis that gripped us was overpowering. The three of us, armed with nothing but flashlights, ventured into the stormy darkness. The wind was sharp, as if it was trying to push us back indoors, away from whatever lay beyond in the night. We called for Chris, our voices almost drowned out by the howling wind and the crack of thunder overhead. The search was frantic and aimless. We moved through the trees, their gnarled branches like fingers reaching out to snag our clothes, to hold us back. After what seemed like hours but were only minutes, we circled back to the house, defeated and shivering. The door, which we had left flapping in the storm, now stood eerily silent and closed. The candles inside flickered, as if welcoming us back into the fold of a nightmare. Stepping inside, our eyes immediately drawn to the Ouija board, we saw the planchette had moved. None of us had touched it, yet there it lay on a new message. One gone, pact bound. The air was sucked out of the room as the gravity of the words hit us. It wasn't just any spirit, it was a keeper of agreements, of old, binding pacts that required something or someone to fulfill them. Jamie collapsed into a chair, his head in his hands, unable to come to terms with the possibility that something supernatural had claimed Chris as part of a ritual we barely understood. Mia stood frozen, her family's legacy now a curse that had threatened her friends. I felt numb, overwhelmed by the irrevocable change in our realities. We had played with fire, and now we were burned, left to face an altered existence where the veil between the seen and the unseen was torn. The following days were a haze. The absence of Chris created a void that was more than his missing presence. It was as if part of the reality we clung to had slipped away with him. Officials were called, search parties sent out, but no trace of Chris was ever found. It was like he had vanished into thin air, a story that was as unbelievable as it was true. As weeks turned to months, I started feeling a presence, whispers at the margin of my hearing, the briefest glimpses of shadows shifting at the edge of my vision. I moved through days in a fog, haunted by the night we touched the beyond, and it touched back. In recounting this story, I wonder if the pact was renewed not just through Chris's disappearance, but through the imprint it left on those who remained. The board was never used again, locked away in the attic where Chris had found it, yet the echo of its power lingered. As I write this, a chill runs down my spine. The shadows in my room seem deeper, the whispers clearer. It's a reminder, a realization that some doors once opened reveal paths that are walked forever. A pact bound by spirit and sacrifice, a story of curiosity turned to horror, and the knowledge that some answers come at an unimaginable price.
What began as a whisper through an old Ouija board ended as a shout into the abyss of our haunted lives. It was supposed to be a mere housewarming, kindled by laughter and old friendships, in an aged, run-down house Michael had recently fallen into owning. The house, a somber relic perched on the skirts of town, seemed like any other fixer-upper, cloaked in the charm of untold stories and a looming, undefined past. How deliciously naive we were, gathered there, adrift in our jovial ignorance. As night unfurled its dark wings, the air inside grew unexpectedly chill, despite the dying warmth of the summer day. Michael, always the host with the most, led us on an impromptu tour, The house was an eclectic mix of outmoded furnishings and long corridors that whispered secrets in every creaking wooden floorboard beneath our feet. And then, in the dusty shadows of the attic, amidst discarded boxes and faded newspapers, we found it, a Ouija board, its surface layered with the grime of neglect, yet undeniably beckoning. Its mere presence twisted our light-hearted adventure into a spine-chilling script. "Let's give this a whirl, shall we?" Michael chuckled, his eyes glittering with a mix of excitement and the unvoiced thrill of the forbidden. His sudden proposal hung in the stale air, heavy like a premonition. Reluctantly, yet somehow inevitably, we gathered around the forgotten oracle. The board felt strangely cold under my fingertips as we placed them lightly upon the planchette. Skepticism breathed within me, but the atmosphere, heavy with the musky scent of old wood and the unknown, painted strokes of doubt across my rational mind. Emily, her face pale and her voice barely a whisper, echoed the discomfort I felt. "Are we sure about this?" she murmured, her fingers trembling slightly upon the wooden heart that promised to dance with spirits. But fueled by Michael's jest and the magnetic pull of the unknown, we proceeded. With a collective, deep breath that seemed to draw the remaining warmth from the room, we asked our first question into the expectant silence. "Is anyone there?" The planchette stirred, slow and almost begrudging at first, before it slid with a purpose we could not ascribe to any among us. Neveralone. The letters were spelled out with methodical certainty, and as the reality of the response settled upon us, an icy draft slipped through the room, punctuating the board's eerie declaration. Laughter broke out nervously amongst us, a countercharm to the creeping dread that sought to root in our hearts. But even as we chuckled, the room's temperature dipped further, enough for our breaths to cloud in brief spectral puffs. Faint but distinct, whispers shuffled through the shadows, as though the house itself responded in hushed tones. Michael's voice trespassed the growing apprehension, still laced with false bravado. "It's just a draft. Old houses like this are full of them," he declared, though his eyes darted uneasily around the dimly lit attic. Our session with the board was only beginning, but the narrative of our night had irreversibly shifted, veering into a suspense none of us had truly anticipated, let alone desired. The planchette seemed to move with more urgency now, as if driven by an unseen force that grew bolder with each of our heartbeats. In the dim candlelight, our shadows played grotesque dances across the walls, creating a haunting spectacle that mirrored the turmoil brewing within us. "Ask it something else," Emily's voice quivered, a stark contrast to her initial curiosity. "Something we couldn't know, to prove." Her voice trailed off, uncertain. Summoning a facade of courage, Michael leaned in, his voice a mix of challenge and fear. "All right, if you're really not just a draft, tell us something we don't know. Show us you're here." No sooner had the words left his mouth than the entire room felt as though it plunged several degrees into iciness. The candles flickered violently as if protesting against an encroaching darkness. We all drew a sharp breath, bracing against the biting cold when a new horror unfolded before us. The windows began to steam up from no discernible source, and as we watched, words started to appear on the fogged glass. "AELPUS," they read, scrawled as though fingered by an invisible hand. The room fell silent, the only sound our synchronized heartbeats thudding against the oppressive thick air of the attic. Fear solidified like ice within my veins, paralyzing, as the stark reality of our encounter descended upon us. In a chaotic burst of fear, we collectively agreed to push the planchette to goodbye. But instead of complying, it began to dart across the board in a maddening flurry of letters, spelling nothing coherent, an apparent testament to the turmoil we had unwittingly unleashed. The candles snuffed out suddenly, casting us into near darkness, saved only by the moonlight leaking around the shades of the now fogged windows. Panic, thick and palpable, filled the room as Emily whimpered softly beside me. "Enough," I declared, my voice cracking as I pulled my hand back from the planchette, breaking the circle. An eerie silence followed, dense and suffocating, as if the house itself held its breath. Then, from somewhere within its bowels, a loud bang resounded, making us all jump. We exchanged wide-eyed looks, the realization dawning that none of us was eager to see what had caused the sound. Michael, his humor now completely extinguished by fear, took charge. "We need to check this out. It could be something serious," he murmured, more to convince himself than us. With hesitant steps, we descended into the lower levels of the house, each creak of the floorboards sounding a sinister note. Our small procession was plagued by an unspoken dread, each shadow and sound magnified by our frazzled nerves. The search led us upstairs, where the bang had seemed to emanate from. The corridor felt endlessly long as we approached the last room. Emily clung to my arm, her earlier premonitions replaced by tangible terror. Reaching the door, Michael pushed it open, revealing nothing but an old, empty room, dust dancing in the beam of his flashlight. But it wasn't the emptiness that captured our attention. It was the absence of our friend Jake, who we suddenly realized was no longer behind us. "Jake?" Michael called out, his voice echoing slightly, betraying his feigned calm. There was no reply, just the heavy silence that now seemed as much a part of the house as its wooden beams. As we turned to retrace our steps, a growing dread filled me. What started as a game had spiraled into a nightmare, one that had just taken an inexplicably darker turn. Our footsteps echoed ominously as we retraced our path, the atmosphere dense with the weight of our collective dread. The realization that Jake was missing turned our already rattled nerves into brittle, frayed edges of panic. We called out his name repeatedly, our voices bouncing off the stark, unanswering walls of the old house. The search led us back to the attic, the heart of our nightmare, where the air felt even heavier, charged with a palpable sense of foreboding. The door creaked ominously as we pushed it open, the dimness inside swallowing up the weak light from our flashlights. And there in the far corner of the room was Jake. He sat on the dusty floor, his back against the wall, mumbling incoherently. His eyes, when he lifted them to ours, held a hollowed-out fear that sent chills down my spine. "He keeps talking about a pact," Emily whispered, her voice trembling as she knelt beside him. Listening closely, I caught snippets of Jake's mumblings, words strung together with a frantic, desperate energy. The owner, he promised, never alone, always spirits to take. The implications of his words were a chilling revelation. The previous owner's entanglements with the spirit world, it seemed, had left a lingering, malevolent presence in the house, one that was not confined to the dusty old Ouija board. Gathering our resolve, we decided to leave the house immediately. Ignoring the whispers that seemed to cling to our heels, we half-dragged, half-carried Jake outside into the cold clarity of the night air. As we looked back at the looming silhouette of the house, it felt as though it watched us go, its windows like dark, knowing eyes. The ordeal, however, did not end with our departure from the house. In the days that followed, each of us felt an invisible thread tugging us back towards the shadowed whispers of that night. Shadows lingered a little longer in our rooms, and whispers brushed against our ears in quiet moments. It seemed as though the spirits had indeed claimed us, marking us with an unseen, indelible ink. The realization that some doors once opened might never be fully closed was a harsh truth that settled deep within my bones. The whispers from the board, now a cacophony in our minds, served as a constant reminder of the night we reached into the unknown, only to be caught in its cold grasp. As I recount this tale, the echo of that first whispered "never alone" resounds eternally, a chilling mantra for the uninvited presence that lingers still, unyielding, and ever-present in the shadowed corners of my life. The Ouija board was not just a game, but a portal, and we had stepped through it naively, irrevocably entwining our fates with what lay beyond. And now we live with the consequences, haunted by the echoes of the damned, a reminder of that night when curiosity drew us into a nightmare without end. The attic was cold, the kind of bone-chilling cold that seeps into your very marrow, untouched by the sporadic warmth from the flickering bulb that dangled overhead. Thunder growled in the distance, as if protesting our intrusion into the shadow-laden realm of forgotten things. Ethan's voice, both curious and commanding, shattered the silence. "Hey, what's this?" His fingers, caked with dust, wrapped around the edge of a wooden box tucked beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Mia, her heart a small drum in her chest, leaned closer. "Looks old, really old." The air thickened with the must of decay and the untold stories of decades past. With a shared glance of reckless curiosity, they summoned Lucy over and together they opened the box to reveal a Ouija board. Its letters faded but legible, the planchette still glossy as if waiting patiently for its next game. "It's just a game, right?" Lucy's voice trembled slightly, betraying her feigned disinterest. "Only one way to find out," Mia replied, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and thrill. They set the board on an old trunk, the makeshift table between them, as the storm outside crescendoed, as if cueing their next move. Action beat 1, initial contact. The room seemed to hold its breath as their fingers collectively touched the planchette. Mia asked the first question, her voice a whisper. "Is there anyone here with us?" The planchette stirred, dragging their fingertips with it, haltingly at first, then with purpose. It slid across to yes. The simple affirmation sent a wave of silent panic through the trio. Ethan, face skeptical, broke the silence with a logical whisper. "It's just subconscious movements, right?" Yet, as if offended by his disbelief, the planchette moved again, this time more swiftly, spelling out, "They watch you." Action beat 2. Escalation of unsettling messages. Choked laughter escaped Ethan as he tried to lighten the mood. "Who's watching us?" "The attic rats." His attempt to mock the situation faltered as the room temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the air. Mia, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, pressed on. "Who are you?" The planchette raced across the board, its movements confident and chilling as it spelled "Watcher." Before they could process this, it moved again, spelling out, "Beware." Lucy pulled her hands back as if burned. "This is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this." Her eyes darted around the dimly lit attic, half expecting to see a manifestation of their unseen communicator. But Mia, adrenaline coursing through her veins, persisted. "What should we beware of?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In response, the lights flickered. A gust of wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere, deep within the bowels of the house, something thudded, heavy and ominous. The planchette spelled out one final word before they could regroup. Everything. In that moment, the game changed. What started as a dare among friends morphed into a terrifying intrusion into the unknown, the unearthly. The attic, with its shadows and secrets, felt suddenly alive, watching, waiting. As the echo of that last message reverberated through their minds, the real horror settled in. They were not alone. Action beat 3. Breaking the session. The tension in the room congealed into a thick, palpable fear as the whispers of everything hung in the stale air. Lucy's hands shook as she reached toward the board, intent on ending this nightmare. "We need to say goodbye. Now." Her voice was a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had embraced the room. Hesitantly, they placed their fingers back on the planchette, urging it towards goodbye. But as if seized by an unseen force, the planchette resisted, snapping back to the center of the board. Ethan's usual composure frayed. "It's not letting us leave." Mia's eyes, wide with fear, darted towards the board again. "We have to try again, together." With collective resolve, they pushed against the resistance, but the planchette spiraled out of control, spelling out "stay" over and over, each iteration more forceful than the last. Action beat 4. Unnatural phenomena. As their struggle with the board intensified, the storm outside crescendoed in tandem. Thunder boomed, as close and as loud as artillery fire, shaking the old house to its bones. The lights flickered more violently, succumbing intermittently to darkness. Their only illumination, the bursts of lightning that painted the room in stark, ghostly white. From the shadowed corners of the attic, the creaks and groans of the house sounded ominously like stealthy steps creeping towards them. Ethan, usually the skeptic, whispered fearfully, "We need to stop. Something's not right." Ignoring his pleas, Mia, driven by a desperate need to end this correctly, pushed the planchette with trembling fingers. "Goodbye. We need to say goodbye." Action beat 5. Forceful termination and immediate aftermath. Finally, with a surge of collective effort and fear-induced adrenaline, they managed to drag the planchette to goodbye. The moment it touched the word, the board seemed to release them, the planchette falling lifeless under their fingers. Instantly, the room brightened slightly as the lights steadied, and the thunder outside muted to a distant grumble. Panting, hearts pounding in their chests like war drums, the friends staggered back from the board, eyes wide and disbelieving. "We're done," Lucy declared, voice trembling, eyes not leaving the board as if it might jump to life again. They packed the board back into its box with hands that could barely coordinate, shoving it into the darkest corner of the attic. Descending the attic stairs, each step took them further away from the darkness above, but did nothing to alleviate the darkness that had settled inside them. Once downstairs, the atmosphere was starkly different. The familiar seemed foreign, each shadow a lurking threat. They huddled together in the living room, not speaking, each lost in their thoughts haunted by the reality of what they had experienced and the lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, they hadn't closed the session as thoroughly as they hoped. Action Beat 6. Lingering Presence and First Predictive Manifestation. In the days that followed, a palpable sense of unease enveloped Mia, Ethan, and Lucy. The comfort of daylight brought little relief. Mia was the first to notice the subtleties. Her keys would vanish, only to reappear in places she'd never put them. Photos seemed slightly askew. Windows would be found open when she was certain she had closed them. It was unsettling, but nothing she couldn't rationalize away until the first prediction came true. It happened to Lucy. The board had warned, lost soon. 2 weeks later, her grandmother, who had been in perfect health, suddenly passed away. The shock sent ripples of dread through the trio, a chilling reminder of the board's ominous power. Their skepticism waned under the growing weight of inexplicable occurrences, each event binding them tighter in a web of fear. Action Beat 7. Confrontation and desperate search for resolution. Determined to sever this connection, they reconvened at Mia's house, their expressions grim. "We need help," Ethan declared, his usual skepticism drowned by the tide of recent events. They contacted a local medium, known for her expertise in the paranormal, hoping she could close what they now believed to be an open portal to the spirit world. The medium, a stern woman with penetrating eyes, arrived with an air of solemnity. She set up in the living room, the same room where they had played with the board. Her rituals were intense, involving chants and various esoteric paraphernalia. As she worked, the air grew thick, the edges of the room dimming as if shadows were leaning in, suffocating the light. Her face contorted in concentration, then suddenly relaxed. "It's done," she sighed, "but be wary. Some doors once opened may never close fully." Ending, an unending haunting life returned to a semblance of normality, but the edges of their reality remained frayed. Mia continued to feel watched, an unseen presence lingering just out of sight. Ethan, once a fierce skeptic, now jumped at shadows, his demeanor forever altered. Lucy kept finding mysterious notes in her handwriting that she didn't remember writing. Warnings, apologies, pleas. Mia lay awake most nights, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. They were subtle, almost loving, a sinister lullaby that promised this was far from over. Each whisper a reminder of the board's final vindictive message: stay. The realization haunted her. They had invited something into their world that reveled in lingering just beyond the veil of visibility, never revealing itself entirely, always watching. The Ouija board had not been a mere game, it had been a doorway. And Mia knew, with dreadful certainty, that some doors once opened might whisper forever. The attic was cold, the kind of bone-chilling cold that seeps into your very marrow, untouched by the sporadic warmth from the flickering bulb that dangled overhead. Thunder growled in the distance, as if protesting our intrusion into the shadow-laden realm of forgotten things. Ethan's voice, both curious and commanding, shattered the silence. "Hey, what's this?" His fingers, caked with dust, wrapped around the edge of a wooden box tucked beneath a moth-eaten blanket. Mia, her heart a small drum in her chest, leaned closer. "Looks old, really old." The air thickened with the must of decay and the untold stories of decades past. With a shared glance of reckless curiosity, they summoned Lucy over, and together they opened the box to reveal a Ouija board. Its letters faded but legible, the planchette still glossy as if waiting patiently for its next game. "It's just a game, right?" Lucy's voice trembled slightly, betraying her feigned disinterest. "Only one way to find out," Mia replied, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and thrill. They set the board on an old trunk, the makeshift table between them, as the storm outside crescendoed, as if cueing their next move. Action Beat 1. Initial contact. The room seemed to hold its breath as their fingers collectively touched the planchette. Mia asked the first question, her voice a whisper. Is there anyone here with us? The planchette stirred, dragging their fingertips with it, haltingly at first, then with purpose. It slid across to yes. The simple affirmation sent a wave of silent panic through the trio. Ethan, face skeptical, broke the silence with a logical whisper. It's just subconscious movements, right? Yet, as if offended by his disbelief, the planchette moved again, this time more swiftly, spelling out, "They watch you." Action beat 2. Escalation of unsettling messages. Choked laughter escaped Ethan as he tried to lighten the mood. Who's watching us? The attic rats. His attempt to mock the situation faltered as the room temperature dropped, their breaths visible in the air. Mia, driven by a mix of fear and fascination, pressed on. Who are you? The planchette raced across the board, its movements confident and chilling as it spelled Watcher. Before they could process this, it moved again, spelling out, Beware. Lucy pulled her hands back as if burned. This is wrong. We shouldn't be doing this. Her eyes darted around the dimly lit attic, half expecting to see a manifestation of their unseen communicator. But Mia, adrenaline coursing through her veins, persisted. What should we beware of? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. In response, the lights flickered. A gust of wind rattled the old windows, and somewhere, deep within the bowels of the house, something thudded, heavy and ominous. The planchette spelled out one final word before they could regroup. Everything. In that moment, the game changed. What started as a dare among friends morphed into a terrifying intrusion into the unknown, the unearthly. The attic, with its shadows and secrets, felt suddenly alive, watching, waiting. As the echo of that last message reverberated through their minds, the real horror settled in. They were not alone. Action beat 3. Breaking the session. The tension in the room congealed into a thick, palpable fear as the whispers of everything hung in the stale air. Lucy's hands shook as she reached toward the board, intent on ending this nightmare. We need to say goodbye. Now. Her voice was a stark contrast to the eerie silence that had embraced the room. Hesitantly, they placed their fingers back on the planchette, urging it towards goodbye. But as if seized by an unseen force, the planchette resisted, snapping back to the center of the board. Ethan's usual composure frayed. It's not letting us leave. Mia's eyes, wide with fear, darted towards the board again. We have to try again, together. With collective resolve, they pushed against the resistance, but the planchette spiraled out of control, spelling out stay over and over, each iteration more forceful than the last. Action beat 4. Unnatural phenomena. As their struggle with the board intensified, the storm outside crescendoed in tandem. Thunder boomed, as close and as loud as artillery fire, shaking the old house to its bones. The lights flickered more violently, succumbing intermittently to darkness. Their only illumination, the bursts of lightning that painted the room in stark, ghostly white. From the shadowed corners of the attic, the creaks and groans of the house sounded ominously like stealthy steps creeping towards them. Ethan, usually the skeptic, whispered fearfully, "We need to stop. Something's not right." Ignoring his pleas, Mia, driven by a desperate need to end this correctly, pushed the planchette with trembling fingers. "Goodbye. We need to say goodbye." Action beat 5. Forceful termination and immediate aftermath. Finally, with a surge of collective effort and fear-induced adrenaline, they managed to drag the planchette to goodbye. The moment it touched the word, the board seemed to release them, the planchette falling lifeless under their fingers. Instantly, the room brightened slightly as the lights steadied, and the thunder outside muted to a distant grumble. Panting, hearts pounding in their chests like war drums, the friends staggered back from the board, eyes wide and disbelieving. "We're done," Lucy declared, voice trembling, eyes not leaving the board as if it might jump to life again. They packed the board back into its box with hands that could barely coordinate, shoving it into the darkest corner of the attic. Descending the attic stairs, each step took them further away from the darkness above, but did nothing to alleviate the darkness that had settled inside them. Once downstairs, the atmosphere was starkly different. The familiar seemed foreign, each shadow a lurking threat. They huddled together in the living room, not speaking, each lost in their thoughts haunted by the reality of what they had experienced and the lingering fear that maybe, just maybe, They hadn't closed the session as thoroughly as they hoped. Action beat 6. Lingering presence and first predictive manifestation. In the days that followed, a palpable sense of unease enveloped Mia, Ethan, and Lucy. The comfort of daylight brought little relief. Mia was the first to notice the subtleties. Her keys would vanish, only to reappear in places she'd never put them. Photos seemed slightly askew. Windows would be found open when she was certain she had closed them. It was unsettling, but nothing she couldn't rationalize away until the first prediction came true. It happened to Lucy. The board had warned, lost soon. 2 weeks later, her grandmother, who had been in perfect health, suddenly passed away. The shock sent ripples of dread through the trio, a chilling reminder of the board's ominous power. Their skepticism waned under the growing weight of inexplicable occurrences, each event binding them tighter in a web of fear. Action beat 7, confrontation and desperate search for resolution. Determined to sever this connection, they reconvened at Mia's house, their expressions grim. "We need help," Ethan declared, his usual skepticism drowned by the tide of recent events. They contacted a local medium, known for her expertise in the paranormal, hoping she could close what they now believed to be an open portal to the spirit world. The medium, a stern woman with penetrating eyes, arrived with an air of solemnity. She set up in the living room, the same room where they had played with the board. Her rituals were intense, involving chants and various esoteric paraphernalia. As she worked, the air grew thick, the edges of the room dimming as if shadows were leaning in, suffocating the light. Her face contorted in concentration, then suddenly relaxed. "It's done," she sighed, "but be wary. Some doors once opened may never close fully." Ending, an unending haunting life returned to a semblance of normality, but the edges of their reality remained frayed. Mia continued to feel watched, an unseen presence lingering just out of sight. Ethan, once a fierce skeptic, now jumped at shadows, his demeanor forever altered. Lucy kept finding mysterious notes in her handwriting that she didn't remember writing. Warnings, apologies, pleas. Mia lay awake most nights, listening to the whispers that seemed to seep through the walls. They were subtle, almost loving, a sinister lullaby that promised this was far from over. Each whisper a reminder of the board's final vindictive message: stay. The realization haunted her. They had invited something into their world that reveled in lingering just beyond the veil of visibility, never revealing itself entirely, always watching. The Ouija board had not been a mere game, it had been a doorway. And Mia knew, with dreadful certainty, that some doors once opened might whisper forever.
In the heart of an ancient mansion, shrouded in the myths of bygone eras and nestled at the edge of oblivion, lay the gateway to a realm untold. This was a world that whispered secrets as old as time, where shadows danced at the corner of your eye and the air hummed with the echoes of the past. Yet amid its hallowed halls and decrepit walls, not all spirits came bearing the tranquility of the afterlife. Some, bound by torment and fueled by vengeance, lingered, watching, waiting for the unsuspecting souls daring enough to breach the veil between worlds. It was this ominous lure that drew us, 4 lifelong friends, into the depths of an adventure that would unravel the fabric of reality as we knew it. The decision to venture into the embrace of the ancient mansion was one born of a mixture of youthful bravado and an insatiable curiosity to pierce the veil of the supernatural. Nathan, ever the daring soul, had proposed the idea, fueled by tales of spirits longing to speak from beyond. Sarah, with her gentle demeanor and a heart open to the mysteries of the universe, was intrigued, her eyes alight with the possibility of undiscovered truths. And then there was me, Alex, straddling the line between skepticism and a covert desire to believe in the tales that haunted our town. Our journey through the mansion was a cautious dance with the unknown, our footsteps echoing through its vast, desolate chambers, stirring the dust of ages past. It was amidst this forgotten grandeur that our eyes fell upon the Ouija board, its surface worn, yet etched with the promise of forbidden knowledge. The air grew thick, charged with an energy that tethered the living to the spirits of yore, wrapping around us like a shroud of anticipation. It was an unspoken agreement, the gravity of the moment silencing any doubts as we gathered around, our hands trembling as they found their place upon the planchette. With bated breath, we invited the spirits to converse, our voices a mere whisper against the weight of silence that enveloped us. The candlelight flickered, casting elongated shadows that danced upon the walls like specters in the night. For what seemed like an eternity, we waited, the line between skepticism and belief blurring with each passing second. It was then, in the stillness that hung between realms, that the planchette stirred to life beneath our collective touch. Its movement was hesitant at first, as if awakening from a slumber that spanned eons. Our hearts raced, a tangible connection forged in that moment, binding us to the entity that dared to cross the threshold. The word hello emerged, spelled out with an eerie precision that sent a shiver down my spine. The atmosphere shifted, a palpable tension creeping into the spaces between us, as if the air itself was laden with whispered warnings. Nathan's eyes sparkled with a mixture of fear and excitement, his earlier bravado giving way to the stark realization of our actions. Sarah's intuition seemed to ripple through the air, her gaze locked on the board with a mixture of awe and apprehension. And there I was, caught in the throes of disbelief and wonder, my skepticism challenged by the undeniable reality that unfolded before us. As we delved deeper, exchanging hesitations for questions, the spirit's responsiveness intensified, weaving a narrative that had remained hidden in the shadows. The revelation of a forgotten pact, tethered to my own lineage, emerged from the depths, the words sending chills down my back. It was a moment of terrifying clarity, the realization that we had awakened something far beyond our understanding, a spirit with intentions obscured by the veil of the unknown. Our encounter had begun as a quest for answers, a challenge to the stories that whispered through the wind. Yet as the entity revealed its connection to me, Alex, an unshakable dread settled within, the implications of its warning echoing in the silence that followed. The session concluded with a foreboding message, residue, leaving us to ponder the true nature of our unwelcome guest. In that moment, what started as a thrill-seeking adventure morphed into a chilling quest for survival. The boundaries of our reality irrevocably altered. The name the spirit spelled out resonated within me, awakening a primal fear, a name that I had heard whispered through hushed tones in my family, laced with shadows and regret. As the realization set in, the playful atmosphere that had initially surrounded our gathering dissipated, leaving in its wake a tension so thick it felt as though it could be sliced with a knife. The air in the abandoned mansion grew colder, the once flickering candle flames now burning steady as if bracing themselves against an unseen chill. Nathan and Sarah looked towards me, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern, questioning silently how my lineage could possibly be intertwined with the events unfolding before us. Beneath the weight of their gazes, I felt isolated, as if standing on the precipice of an abyss, the spirit's warnings echoing in my mind. It spoke of a pact, one woven into the very fabric of my being, a betrayal that had condemned us to a fate far worse than we could have imagined. The realization that our playful foray into the supernatural had unearthed a history so deeply buried sent shivers down my spine. In the days that followed, the gravity of our encounter at the mansion loomed over us, an omnipresent shadow that we could not escape. Nathan tried to rationalize the experience, clinging to logic as a means to dispel the growing fear that encompassed us. Sarah, ever attuned to the energies around her, grew increasingly disturbed, her intuition signaling that the spirit's presence had latched onto us, or more specifically, onto me. The hauntings began subtly at first, easily dismissed as tricks of the mind or mere coincidences. A flicker of light here, an unexpected chill there. But as the days melded into nights, the manifestations grew bolder, more sinister. Objects moved of their own accord, shadows took on forms when I was alone, and the air was often filled with the faint sound of whispered words, a language that tugged at the edges of my memory, yet remained elusive. Driven by a desperation to understand, and perhaps to find a way to sever the connection that had been forged, I embarked on a search through the remnants of my family's past. The attic of my childhood home became the focal point of my quest, a place where dust-covered memories lay forgotten. It was here, amidst the relics of yesteryears, that I stumbled upon an old diary, bound in leather and worn from time. The diary belonged to an ancestor whose name had been mentioned in hushed tones, shrouded in mystery and shame. As I turned the pages, the words penned in a faded script seemed to leap out, drawing me deeper into a tale of betrayal and a pact made with the spirit we had unwittingly awakened. The revelation was a chilling confirmation of the spirit's claims, casting the shadow of a curse that had lingered through generations, waiting for the opportune moment to make its presence known. The knowledge that my family's history was intertwined with a dark and vengeful spirit, bound by a pact made in moments of desperation, filled me with a dread that was palpable. The diary detailed the terms of the agreement, the price of which had been too steep, condemning not only the one who had sealed the pact, but their lineage as well, to an existence marked by the spirit's relentless pursuit of retribution. Armed with the truth, a heavy burden settled upon my shoulders, the lines between the past and the present blurring as I grappled with the reality that my friends and I had been drawn into a web of consequences set in motion long before our own existence. The revelation that I was the key, the link through which the spirit sought to fulfill its vendetta, left me standing on the edge of an abyss, the depths of which promised an unending nightmare from which there was no awakening. With the weight of history pressing down upon me, I knew what had to be done. The only way to sever the ties that bound the spirit to my lineage was to confront it directly, to renounce the pact made in a moment of desperation by an ancestor long gone. Gathering my friends, who had stood by me through the eerie occurrences and sleepless nights that followed our Ouija board encounter, we returned to the dilapidated mansion that had become the epicenter of our nightmare. The air was thick with anticipation as we set up the board once more, the candlelight casting long shadows that danced across the walls like specters mocking our endeavor. Nathan's steadfast presence provided a semblance of strength, while Sarah's intuitive sensitivity to the energies swirling around us offered a guiding light in the darkness that threatened to consume us. As our fingers once again found their places on the planchette, a cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candles and plunging us into darkness. The temperature dropped, our breaths visible in the icy air, as we called out to the spirit, my voice trembling with both fear and resolve. The planchette moved with an urgency we had not experienced before, spelling out a simple, chilling message: too late. The realization that the spirit was not willing to release its hold on my family, to forgive the sins of the past, was a blow that left us reeling. I pleaded, my words a mixture of apology and desperation, but the planchette remained motionless, the silence a stark reminder of our impotence in the face of such ancient, malevolent forces. In the days that followed, the hauntings intensified, a clear indication of the spirit's anger and its refusal to be appeased. Sleep became a luxury, my nights plagued by nightmares that blurred the lines between reality and the macabre realm of the spirit. It seemed as though the very air I breathed was laced with its malice, each shadow hiding malevolence, each whisper carrying threats. The realization that the spirit's influence had weaved itself intricately into the fabric of my existence was a revelation more chilling than any ghostly apparition. It was not merely the physical manifestations of its presence that haunted me, but the knowledge that it sought to manipulate the course of my life, isolating me from those I held dear, and casting a pall over every moment of joy. As I stood in the ruins of the mansion once more, alone this time, I understood that some curses could not be broken, some pacts could not be undone. The spirit's final message to me, delivered in a nightmare that felt all too real, was a simple yet devastating declaration: bound forever. The echo of those words marked the end of my quest for liberation, leaving me to navigate a world in which the line between the living and the dead had been irrevocably blurred. My friends, though still a part of my life, could never truly understand the depth of the haunting that had become my constant companion. In the end, the legacy of my ancestors' pact was mine to bear, an eternal reminder of the price of curiosity and the depth of familial sins. The spirit, a spectral figure ever present at the periphery of my vision, was both my tormentor and my tether to a past that refused to be forgotten. And so, I learned to live with the ripple effects of a story that began long before I was born, a narrative of betrayal and vengeance that had culminated in a haunting that transcended time. In the heart of an ancient mansion, amid whispers of the past and echoes of the damned, I found my truth in the shadows, a residue of all that had been and all that would ever be. It was supposed to be just a game, a foolish challenge against the thundering backdrop of a stormy night. Yet, as the planchette moved with a will of its own, spelling out a name long forgotten, we unknowingly opened a door that, once opened, revealed there was no turning back. The ancient house had stood for over a century, its walls whispering secrets of the past, its floors creaking under the weight of untold stories. It was here, in the dimly lit living room bathed in the eerie glow of candlelight, that we gathered around the old Ouija board, a relic found in the attic, covered in dust and forgotten by time. Sarah, her eyes alight with a mix of excitement and fear, insisted on using it. "It's the perfect night for a seance," she had said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind outside. Mark, ever the protector, had his reservations but agreed nonetheless, his curiosity piqued by the storm's relentless fury. And then there was me, Alex, the skeptic, dismissing their beliefs with a chuckle, yet unable to suppress the gnawing unease at the pit of my stomach as we placed our fingers lightly on the planchette. We called out into the darkness, inviting any spirit willing to communicate. Silence was our only reply, the mocking kind, stretching thin our fading bravado. Just as we began to laugh off our fears, the planchette stirred, jolting us into a stunned silence. It glided across the board with purpose, spelling out a name, Eleanor. The room grew colder, a chill seeping into our bones, as if the mentioning of the name had invited an unseen presence among us. Doubt transformed into palpable fear, an indefinable dread that clung to the air, heavy and oppressive. That night, as the storm raged on outside, a different kind of tempest unfurled in my dreams. Eleanor was there, her spectral form emerging from the shadows, her visage twisted in sorrow and rage. She whispered secrets meant for the dead, her voice a chilling caress that left me paralyzed with fear. I awoke in a cold sweat, the haunting echo of her words lingering in the room, a stark reminder of the door we had carelessly opened. The days that followed were marked by an oppressive sense of dread that clung to us like a second skin. Sarah's vibrant laugh had lost its luster, replaced by a nervous, hollow echo. Mark's protective demeanor had turned watchful, his eyes constantly scanning the shadows for signs of the unexplainable. As the line between reality and nightmare blurred, our skepticism crumbled, leaving us to face the terrifying truth: we were not alone. The spirit of Eleanor, or whatever had answered our call that stormy night, had woven itself into the fabric of our lives, an uninvited guest in the realm of the living. Determined to shed light on the haunting that had besieged us, I turned to the local library, diving into the musty archives that smelled of forgotten lore and ancient secrets. It was there, amidst piles of yellowed newspapers and dusty tomes, that I uncovered the tragic tale of Eleanor. She was a woman out of time, a figure shrouded in mystery and whispered rumors of witchcraft. Her disappearance a century ago had left a mark on the town, a dark stain that whispered of unsolved mysteries and unsettled spirits. With each revelation, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, painting a chilling picture that sent shivers down my spine. The knowledge that we had unwittingly entangled ourselves with a spirit seeking vengeance from beyond the grave filled me with an overwhelming sense of dread. It was no longer a question of belief in the supernatural. It was a reality we were living, terrified and desperate for a way out. As if drawn by our growing fear, the supernatural manifestations intensified. Objects disappeared, only to be found in impossible places. Cold spots filled rooms once warm, and our nights were plagued by nightmares so vivid they left us questioning our sanity. The most unsettling occurrence took place in Sarah's room, where the haunting reached a terrifying crescendo. Symbols, like those from our nightmares, appeared on her walls, written with an unseen hand. Their dark, ominous shapes seemed to pulsate with a malevolent energy, a stark reminder of our folly. Fueled by fear and armed with the knowledge of Eleanor's tormented past, we resolved to confront the spirit directly. Gathering once more around the Ouija board, the air heavy with anticipation and dread, we called out to Eleanor. our voices laced with a mix of desperation and hope. The planchette stirred to life, its movement more purposeful than before, as if energized by our fear. The revelations that followed shattered the last fragments of our skepticism. The spirit we had been communicating with revealed itself not to be Eleanor, but something far older, a malevolent entity that had worn her name as a mask. It spoke of a pact, one we had unknowingly sealed with our curiosity and fear, a bond that granted it a terrifying influence over our lives. The room spun, the air thickened, and in that moment of horrifying clarity, we understood the depth of the darkness we had invited into our world. Our desperate plea for release was met with chilling silence, before the planchette moved with frenetic energy, spelling out a message that would haunt us for the rest of our days. Too late. The weight of those settled over us like a shroud, a grim prophecy of the malevolence that had ensnared us, trapped in a game of its own twisted design. In a final, desperate bid to sever the bond that tethered us to the malevolent presence, we sought the guidance of an old woman known for her knowledge of the occult. With trembling hands and whispered prayers, we prepared for a ritual that was our last beacon of hope in the engulfing darkness. The ancient house, once a haven of laughter and friendship, had transformed into a sinister altar where our fates would be decided. As the ritual commenced, the storm outside mirrored the turmoil within us. Candles flickered as if threatened by an unseen breath, their light casting elongated shadows that danced on the walls like specters. The air crackled with energy, a tangible manifestation of the battle between the wills of the living and the desires of the dead. Words of power were spoken, intricate symbols drawn in salt and offerings made, all in the name of breaking the chains that bound us to the entity. Yet, as the ritual reached its climax, an ear-splitting scream tore through the night, emanating from everywhere and nowhere at once. The candles snuffed out, plunging us into darkness so thick it felt like a physical force. A cold wind swept through the room, and the Ouija board, the innocent instigator of our nightmare, began to shake violently. Then, in a burst of malevolent energy, it combusted, flames consuming it until nothing remained but ashes. Silence fell, a deafening absence of sound that felt like the calm after a storm. We waited, breaths held, hearts pounding, for a sign that our ordeal was over. But the silence stretched on, oppressive, mocking, leaving us to wonder if our actions had sealed our fate or merely angered an entity beyond our comprehension. Days turned into weeks, and the supernatural occurrences that had become our unwelcome companions ceased, leaving behind a haunting silence. Yet the peace that should have filled our hearts was absent, replaced by a lingering dread, a constant over-the-shoulder glance into the shadows where terror had once reigned. The final message of the planchette, "Too late," echoed in our minds, a chilling reminder of our folly. As I write this account, the storm outside mirrors the one from that fateful night, a cruel symmetry that brings the memories flooding back. The lines between reality and nightmare have blurred, leaving me to question what is true and what is the product of a mind touched by darkness. Sarah and Mark bear their own scars, the experience binding us in a way no friendship ever could. The door we opened in search of entertainment became a portal to our own personal hells, a doorway we could close but never lock. The ancient entity, though banished, left its mark on our souls, a shadow that follows us, whispering of the darkness that lies just beyond the veil of our understanding. The Ouija board, that simple game played under the cover of night, became a sobering reminder of the unseen forces that surround us, a warning that some doors once opened can never truly be closed. As the storm rages on, I can't help but wonder if our story is truly at its end, or if this silence is merely the eye of a much larger, more terrifying storm yet to break. It was supposed to be our bridge to the past, a way to say the goodbye we never could. Instead, it became our undoing. The darkness within those four walls felt alive, charged with an anticipation that mirrored our own. None of us could have predicted how deeply we were to spiral into the abyss that night, nor the secrets it would unfurl, secrets that should have remained shrouded in the shadows of our past. My name is Mark. At the time, I was a college student, grappling with the recent death of my sister, Amy. The grief was a constant, gnawing presence, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. It was this desperation, this longing for one final connection, that led me to the Ouija board. Sarah and Lucas, my closest friends, agreed to join me in this endeavor, each harboring their own reasons for participating. Sarah, with her rational mind and sturdy presence, seemed skeptical but supportive. Lucas, always the adventurer, viewed it as another mystery to unravel. That evening, we gathered in my dimly lit living room, the only light emanating from a circle of candles surrounding the Ouija board. The atmosphere was tinged with a nervous excitement that belied our shared skepticism. We positioned our fingers lightly on the planchette, and I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. "Is there anyone here with us?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The moments that followed felt endless in their silence, the air heavy with anticipation. Then, almost imperceptibly, the planchette began to move, gliding with a slow, deliberate motion that sent a shiver down my spine. It spelled out a simple yet chilling message: yes. The mood shifted palpably, our earlier levity replaced by a dawning realization of the gravity of our situation. We were no longer alone. An unsettled energy coursed through the room, an unseen presence making its weight felt. Our initial fears were momentarily pushed aside by the spirit's revelations. It knew things it had no right to know, things about us that had been whispered in the dark corners of our minds, never spoken aloud. Lucas shifted uncomfortably as the entity exposed his secret relationship, the revelation straining the bonds of our friendship. The air in my living room, already thick with the storm's electricity, turned stifling as accusations and denials flew, the spirit's unseen hand deftly sowing the seeds of mistrust among us. What started as an attempt to peer through the veil into the afterlife quickly became a mirror reflecting the darkest parts of ourselves. Our skepticism was shattered, replaced by a fear that perhaps some doors once opened can never be truly closed. In the days that followed, our shared experience at the Ouija session lingered like a dark cloud over us, its ramifications seeping into every interaction, straining the fabric of our friendship. In an attempt to find answers, or perhaps some semblance of peace, I reached out to a medium known within the local community for her expertise with the paranormal. Her reputation was a mix of skepticism and awe, but desperation drove me to seek her out. She agreed to meet with us in my cluttered study, the walls lined with books on the supernatural, remnants of my futile attempts to understand the unseen. The medium, a woman with an ageless quality to her, entered the space with a sense of purpose. Her presence was calming, yet the air seemed to thicken around her, charged with an energy that hinted at her connection to the world beyond. As she listened to our recounting of the Ouija board session, her expression grew increasingly grave. "You've invited something into your lives," she said, her voice laced with a solemnity that sent shivers down my spine. "This entity is not your sister. It's something much older, feeding off your emotions, your guilt, your fear." Her words were a cold splash of reality, confirming our worst fears. The malevolent spirit was using us, manipulating our emotions to strengthen its hold in our realm. She warned us of the danger in continuing our attempts to contact Amy, advising us instead to sever whatever connection we had inadvertently established. As she left, the weight of her warning hung heavy in the air, a shadow that threatened to engulf us. Driven by a mixture of fear and determination, Lucas, Sarah, and I decided to delve into the history of Elmsworth, hoping to unearth any information that could give us insight into the spirit's origins. Our search led us to the local library, its archaic archives a testament to the town's rich and oftentimes dark history. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the gloom, the silence of the place, a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within us. Buried within old newspaper clippings and forgotten journals, we discovered the tragic tale of a mill fire that had claimed numerous lives a century ago, the event shrouded in mystery and rumors of foul play. The location of this tragedy was alarmingly close to my home, a detail that sent a wave of dread coursing through me. It became clear that our malevolent visitor was tethered to this event, its essence intertwined with the tragedy. Armed with this knowledge, we understood what had to be done. We needed to confront the spirit at the site of the mill, to break its connection to our world and send it back to the shadows from which it came. The plan was fraught with danger, a gambit that risked our very souls, but the alternative was a life lived in the shadow of a malevolent presence. Determined yet fearful, we prepared ourselves for what was to come, unaware of the full extent of the horror that awaited us at the abandoned mill. The abandoned mill stood as a macabre monument to tragedy, its skeletal structure a stark silhouette against the twilight sky. As we approached, a sense of dread settled over us, the weight of the spirit's unrest palpable in the chill wind that swept through the ruins. This was to be the battleground, the place where we would confront the malevolent spirit tethered to the land by tragedy and sorrow. The medium's instructions were clear, a ritual to sever the connection, requiring an unwavering focus and unity of purpose amongst us. The air was thick with anticipation and fear as we set up the makeshift altar, the candles casting long, eerie shadows on the decrepit walls. Our resolve was tested as the temperature dropped, an unnatural cold enveloping us, a tangible manifestation of the spirit's anger. Lucas silently began to chant the incantations, his voice steady despite the trembling of his hands. Sarah and I joined in, our voices merging into a singular, desperate plea for release. The wind howled in response, the structure groaning as if in agony, the line between the physical and the supernatural blurring as the ritual reached its climax. Then, silence, a moment suspended in time, where all that existed was the pounding of our hearts and the shallow breaths that escaped our lips. Relief washed over us in a wave, quickly followed by an all-consuming exhaustion that sank into our bones. It seemed at that moment that we had succeeded. The presence that had haunted us was gone, its tether to our world severed by our actions. But victory came at a cost. Lucas, who had been closest to the ritual's epicenter, was found collapsed, his body battered by unseen forces, his spirit diminished by the ordeal. The scars, both physical and mental, would forever serve as a grim reminder of our brush with the supernatural. In the days that followed, Sarah made the heart-wrenching decision to distance herself from the darkness that seemed to cling to our actions. Our friendship, once a bond strengthened by shared experiences, was now a painful reminder of the night we dared to reach beyond the veil. I was left alone, haunted not by spirits, but by the memories of that night. The silence of my home was a stark contrast to the turmoil that raged within, a constant reminder of the price we had paid for our folly. The medium's warning echoed in my mind, a non-ceasing whisper that questioned the very fabric of our reality. In my quest for answers, I had opened a door that should have remained closed, inviting in a darkness that was all too eager to consume us. The ordeal had changed us, leaving marks that were not easily erased, shaping our understanding of the world and our place within it. We had sought to bridge the gap between life and death, to find closure and perhaps a sense of peace. Instead, we found only horror, a chilling revelation of the thin veil that separates our world from the one that lies just beyond our sight. As I sit here, penning this account in the hopes that it may serve as a warning to others, I can't help but wonder what other secrets lie in wait, shrouded in the shadows, yearning for the light. The Ouija board, now locked away in the depths of my attic, serves as a grim reminder of our folly, a testament to the dangers of delving into the unknown. We had sought to speak with the dead, to breach the boundaries that divide worlds. In the end, we learned an invaluable lesson. Some doors, once opened, can never fully be closed. In the twilight shadows of a room dimly lit by the flickering glow of candles, a palpable sense of unease lingered in the air, thick as the pounding silence that filled the space between breaths. This was the night our laughter died, replaced by whispers from the beyond, a night when the past clawed its way into the present with a vengeance no one could have anticipated. My name is Alex, and if you had told me that a simple game could unravel the fabric of reality, exposing the darkest corners of my soul, I would have scoffed. Yet there I was, seated around a battered old Ouija board with my friends, each of us unknowingly standing on the precipice of an abyss that gazed back into us with unseen eyes. Jamie, the instigator of our little expedition into the unknown, wore her excitement like a mask, her eyes alight with the thrill of adventure. Ryan, always the skeptic, rolled his eyes, a smirk playing on his lips, as if daring the universe to prove him wrong. And then there was me, Alex, standing at the crossroads of skepticism and an unspoken, bone-deep dread, my heart beating an erratic tattoo against my ribs, the crescent moon tattoo on my wrist, a stark reminder of nights better left forgotten. As the candles swayed, casting long shadows that danced across the walls like specters at a ball, Jamie placed her fingers delicately on the planchette, urging us to join. Our hands met in the center of the board, a tangle of skepticism and secret fears. The moment our fingers touched the wooden pointer, the air changed, charged with an electric anticipation that raised the hairs on the back of my neck. "Is anyone there?" Jamie's voice, usually so confident, wavered as if the gravity of the moment had finally taken hold. Silence answered, the seconds stretching into eternity, until, all at once, the planchette twitched beneath our collective touch, stirring to life with a will of its own. It glided across the board, halting with deliberate purpose on yes. A collective gasp escaped our lips, a sound born of equal parts terror and wonder. The smirk vanished from Ryan's face, replaced by a growing realization that perhaps, just perhaps, we weren't alone. My skepticism faltered, a crack forming in the armor I'd carefully constructed around myself, as the planchette began to move with renewed intent, spelling out a greeting that chilled me to the core. "Hello, Alex." It knew my name. The room spun, the walls closing in as 1,000 unbidden memories clawed their way to the surface, seeking the light of reckoning. Jamie looked at me, her eyes wide with confusion and a dawning fear. Ryan's skepticism shattered, the implications of that simple greeting setting the stage for a night none of us would ever forget. Our light-hearted foray into the occult had just taken a sinister turn, the Ouija board a conduit to a past I'd fought desperately to bury. As the candles flickered, casting ghostly shadows that seemed to mock us with their dance, I realized the game we thought we were playing had far higher stakes than any of us could have imagined. And so it began. Our descent into a nightmare that straddled the thin line between the living and the dead, a journey that would reveal truths better left undiscovered. Little did we know that invoking the spirit world would rouse not just the specters we sought, but the demons within, laying bare the deepest, darkest corners of my soul. The following days unfolded like a slow descent into madness, shadows lengthening at the edge of my vision, whispers curling around the edges of my mind when I found myself alone. It was as if the session with the Ouija board had peeled back the veil between worlds, leaving me exposed to a haunting that felt all too personal, too targeted to be mere coincidence. Yet among these disturbances, it was the shadows that unnerved me most, a darkness that seemed alive, moving against the physics of light and room, as though it possessed a will of its own. One evening, as I sat alone in my dorm room, the air heavy with the silence of anticipation, a shadow detached itself from the corner of the room and began to creep towards me with a malevolent intent. My breath caught in my throat, heart hammering against my ribcage as I sat frozen, watching the impossible become reality before my eyes. The shadow advanced, morphing, stretching across the floor like a dark hand reaching out to claim me. In a panic, I scrambled away, the chill of fear a tangible thing that clawed at my sanity. The next day, fraught with sleepless dread and unanswered questions, I confessed to Ryan what I had witnessed. Ryan, with his engineering mind, initially attempted to find a logical explanation, speculating about trick of lights or a stress-induced hallucination. Yet beneath his reasoning lay a thread of unease, a recognition that logic had no dominion here. Together, we embarked on a mission to debunk, or at least understand, the phenomena that had overtaken my life. Our investigation was meticulous, yet ultimately fruitless. The shadow remained elusive under the scrutiny of daylight and skepticism. The strain of the haunting began to fray the bonds between us. Jamie, ever the unifier, stepped into the growing divide, her own fear masked by a fierce determination to keep us grounded. She organized a meeting, a chance to air our fears and suspicions in the light of shared experience. Her eyes met mine across the circle we formed, her gaze flickering with the ember of unspoken understanding that what we faced was beyond our understanding, perhaps beyond our ability to confront. In that circle of fading camaraderie, We laid bare our experiences since the night with the Ouija board. Ryan's skepticism eroded by unexplainable mechanical failures that plagued his projects. Jamie's fleeting glimpses of figures in mirrors that vanished when looked upon directly. And my own torment by shadows and whispers that seemed hell-bent on isolating me in a prison of fear. The atmosphere was charged with a mix of fear, desperation, and the dawning realization that we had trespassed into realms best left unexplored. Amid the outpouring of fear and confusion, a fragile plan emerged to confront this entity together, to demand answers, or at least an end to the hauntings. Yet beneath the resolve lay a palpable tension, the unspoken fear that our unity might not be enough, that we had unwittingly unleashed forces that preyed upon the cracks in our friendship, insidious and unseen. As we broke the meeting, the weight of our ordeal hung heavy in the air, a suffocating fog of uncertainty that threatened to swallow us whole. The crescendo of our terror reached its peak on a night shrouded in a darkness that felt almost tangible, a cloak woven from the very fears that had haunted us since that ill-fated seance. As we gathered once more around the Ouija board, the air thick with trepidation and the flicker of candlelight casting macabre shadows across our faces, I knew that this confrontation would peel back the final layers of mystery surrounding the entity known as Malachi. Whether we stood on the brink of revelation or ruin, I could not say. With shaky hands, we once again invited the spirit to communicate, the atmosphere heavy with anticipation and the burden of unspoken fears. The planchette stirred to life beneath our fingers, gliding with eerie precision as if guided by an unseen hand. It was Jamie who voiced the question that hung between us, her voice steady despite the palpable tension. "Who are you, and why are you haunting us?" she demanded, her gaze fixed on the board as if willing it to yield the answers we so desperately sought. The planchette moved, spelling out a response that chilled me to my core. "Alex is past," it declared, before coming to a sudden, ominous halt. In that moment, the room seemed to contract, the walls pressing in with the weight of 1,000 unspoken words. The eyes of my friends bore into me, a mixture of confusion, fear, and a dawning sense of betrayal. It was Ryan's voice that shattered the silence, his words a mix of accusation and disbelief. "Alex, what does it mean? What aren't you telling us?" The dam inside me broke, and with it flowed the dark waters of a past I had fought so hard to keep submerged. In a flood of confession, I laid bare the tragedy that had haunted my every step. The accidental death of my younger brother, a burden of guilt I had carried alone, believing in some twisted way that I was responsible. As the weight of my story hung heavy in the air, the Ouija board once again sprung to life, the planchette moving with frenetic energy as it spelled out a final, chilling message: "Guilt feeds me." The realization hit me like a physical blow. Malachi, whether spirit or some manifestation of my own tortured psyche, had thrived on the guilt and fear I had bottled up inside me. The haunting wasn't just a supernatural phenomenon, it was a reflection of the inner demons I had refused to face. In the days that followed, our group fractured beneath the weight of the revelations and the haunting that had brought them to light. Friendships, once strong, unraveled as if the very fabric that held them together had been corroded by the sinister influence of the entity we had invited into our lives. Jamie and Ryan, though sympathetic to my plight, were consumed by their own fears, their perceptions of me irrevocably altered by the shadows that had clung a little too closely to my soul. As I sought to rebuild the ruins of my shattered life, I was left to ponder the true nature of the entity we had contacted. Was Malachi a malevolent spirit drawn to the darkness within me, or simply the manifestation of my own guilt, given form and voice by the Ouija board? The answer remained elusive, a shadow at the edge of understanding, forever out of reach. The Ouija board, now locked away in the darkest recesses of my closet, serves as a constant reminder of the thin veil that separates the known from the unknown, the seen from the unseen. And though the hauntings have ceased, the shadows of that night linger, a haunting of a different kind, haunting memories of a time when the past rose to claim the present, leaving wounds that may never fully heal.
The manor stood, stoic and singular, at the end of a winding gravel pathway that carved through an overgrowth of wild flora. Its towering silhouette, softened by the creeping twilight, seemed almost welcoming. Or perhaps it was the weariness clouding Nora's judgment after the long drive. She stepped out of her car, the gravel crunching under her boots, a sound oddly comforting in the expansive silence that enveloped the property. This was to be her refuge, her sanctuary from a world that had become too loud, too suffused with memories that clung like persistent shadows. The loss of her sister had carved out a chasm in Nora's life, one that echoed with a grief too profound to navigate. In seeking isolation, Nora hoped to find solace, perhaps even herself, within the manor's age-old walls. The interior of the manor felt like stepping into a different era, where time meandered at its own pace, unhurried by the demands of the modern world. It was in the library, however, that Nora felt the first real tug of curiosity, a whisper from the past that beckoned. The room was lined with shelves groaning under the weight of books whose leather spines spoke of centuries past. It was here, in the dimming light filtered through stained glass windows, that Nora's gaze fell upon a peculiar set of items on a heavy mahogany desk. A dusty Ouija board and an aged diary, bound in faded leather. Intrigue overcame her initial hesitation. The Ouija board, its surface etched with letters and numbers, seemed innocuous enough, a relic of a bygone era's fascination with the occult. But it was the diary, its pages yellowed with time, that drew her in with an almost magnetic pull. Nora couldn't resist. She sat at the desk, the ancient chair creaking under her weight, and tentatively opened the diary. The writing within was elegant, looping across the pages in ink that had faded to a soft sepia tone. The diary belonged to Elizabeth, a young woman who had resided in the manor in the 1920s. What started as idle curiosity quickly deepened as Nora delved into Elizabeth's life. A life marked by joy, sorrow, and a mysterious undertone that hinted at secrets hidden within these walls. Compelled by a force she couldn't articulate, Nora decided to bridge the gap between past and present. She set the diary aside and positioned her fingers lightly on the planchette of the Ouija board. A part of her scoffed at the action, a journalist's skepticism mocking the idea of communing with the dead. Yet, as the twilight deepened into night, enveloping the library in shadows, there was a part of her, perhaps the part still raw with loss, that hoped for a connection, a sign that there was something beyond the tangible. "Is there anyone here with me?" she whispered, half expecting the silence that followed. But then the planchette stirred, a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to drain the warmth from the room. Breath held, heart suddenly pounding with a mix of fear and fascination, Nora watched as it glided across the board, spelling out a welcome that was both impossible and undeniable. "Hello, Nora." The air around her seemed to thrum with an energy that was both foreign and familiar, the sensation leaving her skin tingling. Questions tumbled through her mind, skepticism warring with the burgeoning realization that she was not alone in her search for solace. The past was reaching out, eager to share its secrets, to unravel the mystery that was Elizabeth and the manor. It was in this moment, surrounded by whispers of history and the palpable presence of something beyond, that Nora felt the first real stirrings of hope. Perhaps in seeking to uncover Elizabeth's story, she might find a path through her own grief. With renewed purpose, Nora turned her attention back to the board, the diary, and the invisible thread that seemed to connect them, ready to pull at the seams of reality and uncover the truths hidden within the silence of the manor. The nights that followed were a journey into the unseen, each session with the Ouija board peeling back layers of the manor's history and Elizabeth's life. Nora found herself caught in the ebb and flow of past and present, the diary serving as a bridge between the two. Yet it was during one particular session, as a storm raged outside, that the atmosphere within the library shifted, coiling with a tension that felt charged, anticipatory. Nora's fingertips had barely grazed the planchette when it jolted to life, moving with an urgency she hadn't experienced before. The storm's cacophony seemed to mirror the tumult within her as the planchette spelled out a stark warning: "He watches." The room, already dimly lit by flickering candles, seemed to darken further, the shadows lengthening into shapes that danced just beyond the edge of vision. It was as though the storm outside had found a counterpart within, a tempest of spiritual energy that washed over Nora with a cold dread. The temperature plummeted, breath clouding in the air, and the candles flickered violently, as if struggling against an unseen gale. For the first time since she'd begun this venture into the unknown, fear took root in Nora's heart. Not the fear of the dark or of being alone, but a deep, visceral fear of something ancient and malevolent turning its gaze upon her. The diary, once a source of comfort and curiosity, lay open beside her, its pages fluttering as though caught in a breeze. It was then that the words, scrawled in Elizabeth's elegant hand, took on a new significance, hinting at a darkness that had once stalked the corridors of the manor, a presence whose interest had been rekindled. Shaken, Nora retreated from the library that night, but the sensation of being watched did not abate with distance from the Ouija board or the diary. Sleep became elusive, each creak of the old manor's bones sounding like stealthy footsteps, each whisper of wind a murmur of intent. The boundary between her waking hours and nightmares began to blur, images of shadowed figures and whispered threats bleeding into the daylight. It was amidst this turmoil that Nora found clarity, a realization that the growing sense of dread was not merely her imagination running wild, but a tangible presence making its intentions known. Whatever had been observing her, waiting in the penumbra of her activities, was now closing in, drawn by her interactions with Elizabeth through the Ouija board. Determined not to succumb to fear, Nora took action. She began to delve into the manor's history, seeking out local archives and records that might shed light on the identity of the ominous presence. Simultaneously, she revisited Elizabeth's diary with a critical eye, searching for any mention of the spirit that now seemed intent on merging its story with hers. What she uncovered in those pages was a narrative tinged with despair, a chronicle of Elizabeth's encounters with a figure she referred to only as the Shadowed One. Descriptions of cold gusts, unexplained malaise, and the sensation of being watched mirrored Nora's experiences, weaving a tapestry of fear that spanned decades. Elizabeth's entries became increasingly fraught as the presence grew bolder, culminating in a desperate plan to confront the spirit, cut tragically short by her untimely death. Armed with this knowledge, Nora realized the gravity of what she faced. Somehow, her attempts to connect with Elizabeth had awoken something that had lain dormant, a darkness that had claimed Elizabeth and now sought Nora. Yet within the diary's accounts, between lines of fear and strategies of evasion, lay a thread of hope, a series of rituals and ancient practices Elizabeth believed could protect her, a legacy of knowledge that Nora now inherited. As the storm outside the manor abated, revealing a sky washed clean of its earlier fury, a sense of resolve settled over Nora. The path before her was fraught, lined with the echoes of Elizabeth's terror and the looming threat of the Shadowed One, but it was a path she knew she must walk. For in seeking to uncover the past, Nora had unearthed a fight that was now hers to finish. A battle not just for her peace, but for Elizabeth's too. With determination steeling her resolve, Nora prepared to face the darkness, armed with ancient wisdom and the unbreakable bond forged across time with Elizabeth. The manor, once a sanctuary from her grief, had become the battleground for a deeper, more primal conflict, one that Nora was determined to win. Nora stood in the oldest part of the manor, her resolve a tangible force against the encroaching darkness. The room, once used for clandestine gatherings of those who dabbled in the esoteric, now held the key to confronting the entity that stalked the shadows of her new home. Armed with Elizabeth's diary, the ancient rituals inscribed within its pages, and an unwavering will to end the nightmare, Nora began her preparation. The storm had cleared, leaving an ominous quiet that enveloped the manor. Candlelight flickered across ancient symbols Nora had painstakingly recreated on the floor, their meanings imparted through Elizabeth's recorded experiences. Each candle, each sigil, each whispered incantation served as a beacon, calling the Shadowed One into the open. As the ritual reached its crescendo, the temperature plummeted, breath visible in the charged air. The shadows twisted, coalescing into a form both nebulous and terrifyingly distinct. The presence she had felt since her arrival now stood before her, a darkness that hungered, that desired dominion over life and death. The Shadowed One, Nora breathed, her voice steady despite the fear that clawed at her heart. This was the entity that had claimed Elizabeth, that now sought to claim her. But Nora was not Elizabeth. She was armed not just with knowledge, but with a determination born of loss and a fierce desire to protect what she had come to see as her own. The entity moved, a ripple in the dark, its intent clear as the air grew thick with malice. Words from the diary echoed in Nora's mind, guiding her hand as she reached for the talisman she had fashioned, a physical manifestation of her bond with Elizabeth. As she held it aloft, a light burst forth, piercing the darkness with a purity that seemed to halt the entity in its tracks. Nora's voice rang out, clear and commanding, reciting the final incantation. The room trembled, the air vibrating with the power of her words, of the ritual that reached back through the ages to draw upon a strength that eclipsed the darkness before her. A scream, not of this world, filled the space, the entity writhing as the light from the talisman became a blade, severing its tether to the manor, to the mortal plane. And then, as suddenly as it had all begun, it was over. Silence, deep and profound, fell upon the room. The candles flickered once more, the shadows retreating to their natural place, their threat extinguished. Nora stood, breathless, the weight of the talisman in her hand a reminder of the battle fought and won. In the days that followed, the manor seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, its halls brighter, the oppressive atmosphere that had once permeated its walls lifted. Nora could feel the change, a peace that mirrored her own heart's slow mending. Elizabeth's diary, once a source of fear and uncertainty, now lay open on the desk in the library, a testament to the journey undertaken, to the darkness faced and defeated. Nora had come to the manor seeking solace, a respite from a world that had become too painful to bear. In its walls, she had found not just a home, but a purpose, a connection to something greater than herself. She had confronted her grief, her fears, and in doing so, had found a strength she hadn't known she possessed. As she looked out over the grounds of the manor, the sunlight dappling the earth with warmth, Nora understood that the battle fought was not just for her own soul, but for Elizabeth's as well. In banishing the Shadowed One, she had not only reclaimed her sanctuary, but had honored the bond that linked her across time to Elizabeth. The manor, once a place of sorrow and darkness, now stood as a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring power of the spirit and the unbreakable bonds of love. The end of her ordeal marked not an ending, but a beginning, a new chapter in a story that she now knew was interwoven with threads of the past, rich with the promise of tomorrow. Nora, with a heart now open to the mysteries of life and the assurance that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone, stepped forward into the light of her new day. In the heart of the city, tucked between the modern gloss of glass storefronts and the weathered charm of cobblestone streets, there was a hidden gem of a shop that few knew about and even fewer ventured into. Arcane Reads, a quaint bookstore with an air of mystery, was where Mia found herself on a drizzly afternoon that felt more like a scene from one of her novels than real life. The air inside was thick with the scent of old paper and whispered secrets, shelves overflowing with books that spanned the mundane to the esoteric. Mia, an aspiring horror writer with a curiosity that often edged into realms few dared to explore, was drawn to a peculiar ornate box tucked away in the shop's most secluded corner. The shopkeeper, an aged man with eyes that seemed to carry centuries of stories, merely nodded when Mia inquired about the box, as if approving a rite of passage. The box revealed a beautifully crafted Ouija board, its wood polished by time, etched with intricate symbols that felt oddly familiar. Mia's heart raced with the anticipation of story ideas this board could inspire. Little did she know, purchasing it would alter the course of her life in ways no pen could ever write. Action Beat 1, Mia's first encounter. That night, in the quiet solitude of her apartment, surrounded by stacks of research and half-filled cups of cold coffee, Mia prepared to use the Ouija board. With a mix of skepticism and excitement, she placed her fingers lightly on the planchette, half expecting it to remain still. After a moment of silence, the planchette stirred to life, spelling out, "Hello, Mia." The sudden rush of the unknown sent a chill down her spine, her initial disbelief overshadowed by an emerging curiosity. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette moved with purpose, spelling out, "You." Action beat 2. The warning, confusion, and a hint of fear knotted in Mia's stomach as she pressed on. "What message do you have for me?" she dared to ask. The planchette's movement became erratic, as if struggling against unseen forces, before spelling out a chilling warning. "Danger, trust no one." The room felt colder, the air heavier, as if charged with a foreboding energy. Mia's logical mind fought for rational explanations, but the seed of unease had been planted. She ended the session, unable to shake the feeling that her life was about to intertwine with threads of fate she couldn't comprehend. Action beat 3. Correlation with reality. The following days were marked by a series of unexplainable events that mirrored the Ouija board's warning. Mia received anonymous, threatening letters, and her best friend Theo narrowly escaped an accident that seemed too calculated to be coincidental. Each incident drove home the reality of the board's message, eroding her skepticism and replacing it with a creeping dread. Mia turned to Theo, sharing the board's warning and the subsequent events. Skeptical but concerned, Theo agreed to help Mia delve into the mystery of the Ouija board, not realizing that their quest would unearth secrets buried deep within Mia's lineage. As the pieces began to align, Mia understood that the board was not merely a conduit for the supernatural, but a key to unraveling her family's dark past. With the realization that the threats were not just to scare her but to warn her, Mia and Theo set out on a path that would lead them through the shadowy realms of history, occult pacts, and a battle for control over their destinies. As Mia and Theo delved deeper into the mystery, their search led them to the local library's restricted section, where ancient manuscripts on the occult were kept under lock and key. With Theo's historical knowledge and Mia's instinctive understanding of the supernatural, they unearthed a journal belonging to Mia's great-grandmother, Sophia. Action beat 4. The journal revelation. Under the dim light of the library, the whispers of the past seemed to leach from the pages of Sophia's journal. It was here that Mia learned of the pact, a desperate agreement struck by Sophia with a powerful spirit to protect her bloodline from a looming threat in her time. In exchange, every future generation was bound to the spirit realm, marked by the ability to connect with the beyond. The revelation was a staggering blend of horror and fascination for Mia, explaining the unspoken shadows in her family's history and her own inexplicable pull towards the Ouija board. Action beat 5. The path to breaking the pact. The journal contained more than just the history of the pact. It hinted at a possibility of breaking it. According to Sophia, the key lay in conducting a ritual during the lunar eclipse, at a place of powerful spiritual significance to their bloodline. Mia and Theo's resolve hardened, understanding the stakes were no longer just personal safety, but freeing their lineage from an eternity of servitude to the spirit realm. Determined, Mia and Theo set about gathering the artifacts and knowledge required for the ritual. Their efforts were fraught with challenges, both mundane and supernatural. Strange occurrences became more frequent, ranging from unexplained malfunctions of their research equipment to shadowy presences felt watching them from the dark. Despite these intimidations, their bond strengthened, a beacon of human resilience amidst the encroaching darkness. Action beat 6. Confronting the guardian spirit. Their preparations culminated on the night of the lunar eclipse. Guided by Sophia's journal, they found themselves at an ancient, forgotten grove that resonated with an eerie energy. As they began the ritual, outlined meticulously in the journal's pages, the spectral form of the guardian spirit of the pact materialized, its presence overwhelming, threatening to fracture their resolve. The air thickened with tension as the spirit challenged Mia, its voice a cacophony of whispers that seemed to echo from the very earth beneath them. It tempted, threatened, and tried to deceive her, aiming to dissuade their endeavor. But Mia, fueled by a newfound understanding of her heritage and an unyielding desire for freedom, stood firm. The ritual's completion within the grove, under the shadowed light of the eclipse, was their only chance to break the chains binding her family to the spirit realm. The climax of their confrontation was marked by a surge of energy that radiated through the grove, the spirit's form flickering as it fought to maintain its hold. Mia and Theo, united in purpose, pushed forward, chanting the final words of the ritual as the last sliver of the moon vanished, shrouding the world in darkness before being reborn into light. As the lunar eclipse reached its zenith, Mia and Theo, encircled by the enigmatic forces summoned by the ritual, felt the intensity of the moment bear down upon them. Shadows danced at the edge of the grove, the boundary between the realms thinning, the spirit's form becoming more erratic, its influence waning under the ritual's power. Action Beat 7, the breaking of the pact. In a final, desperate attempt to maintain its grip, the spirit unleashed a maelstrom of ethereal energy, aiming to shatter the resolve of its challengers. However, Mia, with a clarity born of her lineage and her own unyielding will, channeled her focus into the ritual's artifact, a locket passed down through generations. As the locket absorbed the energy, it emitted a brilliant light, casting the grove in a luminance that rivaled the eclipse itself. Their voices, intertwined in the incantation, reached a crescendo. The ground beneath them trembled, the air crackled with power, and then, as if in defiance of the darkness, the eclipse began to wane, revealing the moon's light once more. The spirit, its form disintegrating under the ritual's onslaught, emitted a final otherworldly scream before dissipating into the ether. The pact it had guarded for centuries, broken at last. Action Beat 8, the aftermath. The grove fell silent, the tumultuous energies dissipating as quickly as they had risen. Mia and Theo, exhausted but elated, faced each other in the aftermath, the weight of their actions settling in. The locket that had been central to the ritual's success lay open in Mia's hand, its light dimmed, now a simple piece of metal and stone, a relic of their ordeal. In the quiet that followed, the reality of their success dawned upon them. They had not only confronted, but overthrown the chains of a supernatural legacy that had bound Mia's family for generations. Yet, in their victory, there was an understanding of the sacrifices made by those before them, of the strength required to face such unearthly threats. Action Beat 9, a new dawn. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink, Mia and Theo left the grove, the ritual artifacts and Sophia's journal in hand. Their departure was not just from a place of power, but from an old chapter of Mia's family legacy, now concluded. They returned to their world, carrying with them the knowledge of the unseen and the understanding that some mysteries were best left unexplored. The Ouija board, the catalyst for their journey, had vanished without a trace, its purpose served and its role in their lives concluded. Ending. In the weeks that followed, life returned to a semblance of normality, but the shadow of their experience lingered. Mia turned to her writing, the events they had lived through bleeding onto the pages, transforming her horror novel into something far more personal and profound. Theo remained by her side, a steadfast presence, their bond deepened by the trials they had endured. Together they faced the future, a future unshackled from the past, their spirits no longer tethered to the whims of another realm. Yet, as Mia penned the final words of her novel, a soft whisper seemed to echo through the room, a reminder of the thin veil between worlds. The Ouija board was gone, but the mystery of the beyond and the respect it demanded remained. They had won their freedom, but at the heart of their victory was the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never be fully closed.